An unabridged recording of Hidden Empire, Book 1 of the Saga of the Seven Sons, by Kevin J. Anderson, narrated by George Guidell. This work is copyrighted 2002 by Wordfire Incorporated. This recording is copyrighted 2002 by Recorded Books. Having colonized the worlds of the Spiral Arm, the three branches of humanity consider themselves lords of creation. After all, humans share the galaxy with only two alien species, one harmless and one extinct. But in their pride, the upstart worlds of man have misunderstood the brutal realities of the galaxy, and now face their own impending doom. And now, Hidden Empire.
Chapter 1. Margaret Colicos. Safe in orbit high above the gas giant, Margaret looked through the observation port at continent-sized hurricanes and clouds far below. She wondered how long it would take for the entire planet to catch fire once the experiment began. Ancière was a pastel globe of hydrogen and mixed gases 5 times the size of Jupiter. Moons surrounded the gas giant like a litter of pups jostling against their mother. The 4 of greatest interest were large bodies of ice and rock named Jack, Ben, George, and Christopher after the first 4 great kings of the Terran Hanseatic League. If today's test proved a success, those moons could eventually be terraformed into Earth-like colonies. If the Cliquis torch failed, the respected career of Margaret Colicos would fizzle along with it. But she would survive. As xenoarchaeologists, she and her husband Louis were accustomed to working in blissful obscurity. In preparation for the experiment, the technical observation platform bustled with scientists, engineers, and political observers. Though Margaret had nothing to do with the actual test, her presence was still required here. A celebrity. She had to make a good show of it. After all, she had discovered the alien device among the ruins. Tucking gray-streaked brown hair behind her ear, she looked across the deck and saw Louis grinning like a boy. They'd been married for decades and had never worked without each other. It had been years since she'd seen him in a dashing, formal suit. Margaret could tell how much he reveled in the excitement, and she smiled for his sake. She preferred to watch people rather than interact with them. Louis once joked that his wife had become fascinated with archaeology on alien planets because there was no chance she might have to strike up a conversation with one of her subjects. With plenty of dirt under their fingernails and groundbreaking discoveries on their resumes, Margaret and Louis Colicos had already sifted through numerous worlds abandoned by the insect-like Cliquis race, searching for clues to explain what had happened to their vanished civilization. The alien empire had left only ghost cities and occasional tall, beetle-like robots that bore no helpful memories of their progenitors. In the eerie ruins on Corybus, the Colicos team had discovered and deciphered the remarkable planet-igniting technology they had called the Cliquis torch. Now excitement thrummed in the filtered air of the observation platform. Invited functionaries crowded around the observation windows, talking with each other. Never before had humans attempted to create their own sun. The consequences and the commercial possibilities were far-reaching. Chairman Basil Wenceslas noticed Margaret standing alone. When a small-statured server compy came by bearing a tray filled with expensive champagne, the powerful chairman of the Terran Hanseatic League snagged 2 extruded polymer glasses and walked over to her, proud and beaming. "Less than an hour to go." She dutifully accepted the glass and indulged him by taking a drink. Since the reprocessed air of the observation platform affected the senses of smell and taste, a cheaper champagne would probably have tasted as good. I'll be glad when it's over, Mr. Chairman. I prefer to spend my time on empty worlds, listening for the whispers of a long-dead civilization. Here, there are too many people for me. Across the deck, she saw a green priest sitting silent and alone. The emerald-skinned man was there to provide instantaneous telepathic communication in case of emergency. Outside the observation platform hung a ceremonial fleet of alien warliners. 7 spectacular ships from the solar navy of the Ildirans, the benevolent humanoid race that had helped mankind spread across the stars. The beautifully decorated Ildiran ships had taken up positions where they could observe the spectacular test. "I understand perfectly," the chairman said. "I try to stay out of the limelight myself." Wenceslas was a distinguished man, one of those people who grew more attractive and sophisticated with each passing year, as if he learned how to be suave rather than forgot how to be physically fit. He sipped his champagne, but so slightly that it barely seemed to wet his lips. "Waiting is always so hard, isn't it? You're not accustomed to working with such a rigid time clock." She answered him with a polite laugh. "Archaeology is not meant to be rushed, unlike business." Margaret just wished she could get back to work. The chairman touched his champagne glass against Margaret's like a kiss of crystal. "You and your husband are an investment that has certainly paid off for the Hanseatic League." The xenoarchaeologists had long been sponsored by the Hansa, but the star-igniting technology she and Lewis had discovered would be worth more than all the archaeology budgets combined. Working in the cool emptiness of Corybus, sifting through the ideographs painted on the walls of Clickis ruins, Margaret had been able to match up the precise coordinates of neutrons, stars, and pulsars scattered around the spiral arm, comparing them with maps developed by the Hansa. This single correlation caused an avalanche of subsequent breakthroughs. By comparing the coordinates of neutron stars from the Clickis drawings with known stellar drift, she had been able to back-calculate how old the maps were. Thus, she determined that the Clickis race had disappeared 5,000 years ago. Using the coordinates and diagrams as a key, as well as all the other information compiled on numerous digs, Lewis, with his engineering bent, had deciphered Clickis mathematical notations, thereby allowing him to figure out the basic functioning of the torch. The chairman's gray eyes became harder, all business now. "I promise you this, Margaret. If the Clickis torch does function as expected, choose any site you wish, any planet you've wanted to explore, and I will personally see that you have all the funding you require." Margaret clinked her glass against his in a return toast. "I'll take advantage of that offer, Mr. Chairman. In fact, Lewis and I have a likely site already picked out. The previously untouched ghost world of Reindick Cove, full of mysteries, pristine territory, uncatalogued ruins. But first, they had to do their duty dance here and endure the public accolades after they ignited the gas world below. Margaret went to stand beside Lewis. She slipped her arm through his as he struck up a conversation with the patient green priest who waited beside his potted world tree sapling. She could hardly wait for the experiment to be finished. To her, an empty ancient city was far more exciting than setting a whole planet ablaze. Chapter 2. Basil Wenceslas. Quiet and unassuming, Basil Wenceslas moved through social circles. He smiled when he was supposed to, bantered when expected, and filed the details in his mind. To an outsider, he never showed more than a fraction of his deepest thoughts and intricate plans. The Terran Hanseatic League depended on it. A well-preserved older man whose age was difficult to determine, even with close study, he had access to vigorous anti-aging treatments and availed himself of cellular chelation techniques that kept him limber and healthy. Dapper and distinguished, he wore impeccable suits that cost more than some families earned in a year, but Basil was not a vain man. Though everyone on the observation platform knew he was in charge, he maintained a low profile. When an overeager mahogany-skinned media charmer asked him for an interview about the Clickis torch, he diverted the woman and her recording crew to the chief scientist of the project, then melted into the small crowd, watching, observing, thinking. He looked out at the great ball of ochre clouds that made Ancier look like a poorly stirred confection. This system had no habitable planets, and Ancier's gas mix was not particularly appropriate for harvesting ecti, the exotic allotrope of hydrogen used in Ildiran star drives. This out-of-the-way gas giant was an excellent test subject for the unproven Clickis torch. Chief Scientist Gerald Serizawa talked smoothly and passionately about the upcoming test, and the media crew pressed forward. Beside him, technicians manned banks of equipment. Basil scanned the control panels, assessing the readings for himself. Everything was on schedule. Dr. Serizawa was completely hairless, though whether because of a cosmetic choice, a genetic predisposition, or an exotic disease, Basil didn't know. Lean and energetic, Serizawa spoke with his hands as much as his voice, gesturing broadly. Every few minutes, like clockwork, he grew self-conscious and clasped his hands to keep them motionless in front of him. Gas giants, such as Jupiter in our own home solar system, are on the edge of a gravitational slope that could send them into stellar collapse. Any planetary body between 13 and 100 times Jupiter's mass will burn deuterium at its core and begin to shine. Serizawa jabbed an insistent finger at the media charmer who had approached Basil earlier. With this rediscovered technology, we can push a gas giant such as Ancier over the mass limit so that its core will ignite nuclear fires and turn this big ball of fuel into a brand-new sun. The woman broke in. Please tell our audience where the increase in mass comes from. Serizawa smiled, delighted to explain further. Basil crooked his mouth in a faint expression of amusement. He thanked his luck that the bald doctor was such an enthusiastic spokesman. You see, the Clickis torch anchors two ends of a wormhole at tunnel 10 kilometers wide. It was clear his listeners knew little about wormhole mechanics and the difficulty of creating such a huge space-time gap. We open one terminus near a superdense neutron star, then target the other end at the core of Ancier. In the blink of an eye, the neutron star is transported into the planetary heart. With so much added mass, the gas giant will collapse, ignite, and begin to shine. This light and heat, you see, will make the largest moons habitable. One of the media recorders pointed an imager at the white glints orbiting the pastel gas planet as Serizawa continued. Alas, the new sun will burn for only 100,000 years, but that's still plenty of time for us to make the 4 moons into productive Hansa colonies. Practically an eternity as far as we're concerned. Basil nodded unobtrusively to himself. Typical short-term thinking, but useful. Now that Earth was part of a much larger galactic network, though, true visionaries would have to operate on a completely different timescale. Human history was only one small part of the canvas. Therefore, the Clickis torch opens up many new opportunities for the Hansa to create habitats that meet the needs of our growing human population. Basil wondered how many swallowed that explanation. It was part of the answer, of course, but he also noted the huge, gaudy Ildiran warliners standing watch, reminding him of the real reasons for this extravagant demonstration. The Clickis torch must be tested not because there was a desperate need for extra living space. There were many more acceptable colony worlds than humans could ever settle. No, this was a move of political hubris. The Hansa needed to prove that humans could actually do this thing, a grand and extravagant gesture. 183 years ago, the Ildiran Empire had rescued the first Terran generation ships from their aimless journeys through space. The Ildirans had offered humans their fast star drive and adopted Earth into the sprawling galactic community. Humans viewed the Ildiran Empire as a benevolent ally, but Basil had been watching the aliens for some time. The ancient civilization was stagnant, full of ritual and history, but very few fresh ideas. Humans had been the ones to innovate the Ildiran star drive technology. Eager colonists and entrepreneurs, even the space gypsy riffraff of the Romer clans, had rapidly filled the old Ildiran social and commercial niches so that humans gained a substantial foothold in just a few generations. The Hansa was growing by leaps and bounds while their stodgy alien benefactors were fading. Basil was confident humans would soon subsume the ailing empire. After the Clickist Torch demonstration, the Ildirans would remain impressed by Terran abilities and deterred from any temptation to test human mettle. Thus far, the alien empire had shown no sign of aggression, but Basil didn't entirely believe the altruistic motives of the cozy Ildiran neighbors. It was best to maintain a prominent reminder of human technological abilities and, better still, to be subtle about it. While the test countdown proceeded toward zero, Basil went to get another glass of champagne. Chapter 3. Adar Korin. From the command nucleus of his prime warliner, Adar Korin, Supreme Admiral of the Ildiran Solar Navy, contemplated the humans' folly. Though the outcome of this preposterous test would have a significant bearing on future relations between the Ildiran Empire and the Terran Hanseatic League, the Adar had brought only a septa, a group of 7 warliners. The mage Imperator had instructed him not to display too much interest in the event. No Ildiran should be too impressed by any action from these upstarts. Even so, Korin had refitted his battleships as a matter of pride, painting sigils on their hulls and adding dazzling illumination strips as primary markings. His warliners looked like ornate deep-sea creatures preparing for an outrageous mating display. The Solar Navy understood pageantry and military spectacles far better than the humans did. The Hansa chairman had invited Korin to come aboard the observation platform where he could watch the artificial ignition of the gas giant. Instead, the Adar had chosen to remain here, aloof, inside the command nucleus. For now. Once the actual test began, he would arrive with politically acceptable tardiness. Korin was a lean-faced half-breed between noble and soldier kith, like all important officers in the Solar Navy. His face was smooth, with human-like features because the higher kiths resembled the single breed of human. Despite their physical similarities, though, Ildirans were fundamentally different from Terrans, especially in their hearts and minds. Korin's skin had a grayish tone. His head was smooth, except for the lush topknot folded back across his crown, a symbol of his rank. The Adar's single-piece uniform was a long tunic made from layered gray and blue scales belted about his waist. To emphasize the low importance of this mission, he had refused to pin on his numerous military decorations, but the humans would never notice the subtlety when he met them face to face. He watched the bustling scientific activities with a mixture of condescending amusement and concern. Though the Ildirans had assisted the fledgling race many times in the past 2 centuries, they still considered humans to be impatient and ill-behaved. Cultural children, adoptive wards. Perhaps their race needed a godlike, all-powerful leader such as the mage Imperator. The golden age of the Ildiran Empire had already lasted for millennia. Humans could learn much from the elder race if they bothered to pay attention, rather than insisting on making their own mistakes. Korin could not comprehend why the brash and overly ambitious race was so eager to create more worlds to terraform and settle. Why go to all the trouble of creating a new sun out of a gas planet? Why make a few rugged moons habitable when there were so many acceptable worlds that were, by any civilized standard, nowhere near crowded enough? Humans seemed intent on spreading everywhere. The Adar sighed as he stared out the front viewing screen of his lead warliner. Disposable planets and disposable suns. How very Terran. But he would not have missed this event for all the commendations the Mage Imperator had left to give. In ancient times, the Solar Navy had fought against the terrible and mysterious Shanari, and the military force had been required to fight against the deluded Ildirans in a heart-rending civil war 2,000 years ago. But since that time, the fleet had been mainly for show, used for occasional rescue or civil missions. With no enemies and no interplanetary strife in the Ildiran Empire, Corin had spent his career in the Solar Navy managing ornate, ceremony-driven groupings. He had little experience in the area of battle or tactics, except to read about them in the saga. But it wasn't the same. The Mage Imperator had dispatched him to Ancier as the Empire's official representative, and he had obeyed his god and leader's commands. Through his faint telepathic link with all of his subjects, the Mage Imperator would watch through Corin's eyes. No matter what he thought of it, though, this bold human attempt would make an interesting addition to the Ildiran historical epic, the Saga of the Seven Sons. This day, and probably even Corin's name, would become part of both history and legend. No Ildiran could aspire to more than that. Chapter 4. Old King Frederick. Surrounded by the opulence of the Whisper Palace on Earth, old King Frederick played his part. Basil Wenceslas had given him orders, and the great monarch of the Hansa knew his place. Frederick did exactly as he was told. Around him, court functionaries kept busy writing documents, recording decrees, distributing royal orders and benevolences. The Whisper Palace must be seen as a constant flurry of important matters conducted in a professional and orderly fashion. Wearing heavy formal robes and a lightweight crown adorned with holographic prisms, Frederick awaited word from Ancier in the throne hall. He was bathed and perfumed, the many rings on his fingers polished to a dazzle. His skin had been massaged with lotions and oils, his hair was perfect, not a single strand could be seen out of place. Though he had originally been chosen for his looks, charisma, and public speaking abilities, Frederick knew the foundation of his monarchy better than the most attentive student of civics. Because any real-time political hold over such a vast galactic territory would be tenuous at best, the Hansa depended on a visible figurehead to speak decrees and issue laws. The populace needed a concrete person in whom to invest their loyalty, since no one would fight to the death or swear blood oaths for a vague corporate ideal. Long ago, a royal court and a well-groomed king had been manufactured to give the commercial government a face and a heart. As with his 5 predecessors, King Frederick existed to be seen and revered. His court was filled with gorgeous clothing, polished stone, rich fabrics, tapestries, artworks, jewels, and sculptures. He awarded medals, threw celebrations, and kept the people happy with the benevolent sharing of the Hansa's wealth. Frederick had everything he could ever need or want, except for independence and freedom. Basil had once told him, "Humans have a tendency to abdicate their decision-making to charismatic figures. That way they force others to take responsibility, and they can blame their problems upward in a hierarchy." He had pointed to the king, who was so weighed down with finery that he could barely walk. "If you follow that to its logical conclusion, any society will end up with a monarchy given enough time and choice." After 46 years on the throne, Frederick could barely remember his younger life or his original name. He had seen significant changes in the Hanseatic League during his reign, but little of it had been his own doing. Now he felt the burden of his years. The king could hear the rush of fountains, the hum of dirigibles, the roar of the ever-swelling crowds in the royal plaza below, waiting for him to address them from his favorite speaking balcony. The Archfather of Unison was already leading them in familiar scripted prayers, but even as the crowds followed along, eager citizens pressed forward, hoping for a glimpse of their splendid monarch. Frederick wanted to remain inside as long as possible. After its construction in the early days of Terran expansion, the gigantic ceremonial residence had rendered visitors speechless with awe, hence its name, the Whisper Palace. Always lit cupolas and domes were made of glass panels crisscrossed with gilded titanium support braces. The site had been chosen in the sunny, perfect weather of the North American West Coast in what had once been Southern California. The palace was larger than any other building on Earth, vast enough to swallow 10 Versailles. Later, after the Hansa had encountered the jaw-dropping architecture in the Illyrian Empire, the Whisper Palace had been expanded further, just to keep up. At the moment, though, the beauty around him could not keep Frederick's mind occupied as he impatiently waited to hear from Basil at distant Ancier. "Momentous events do not happen in an instant," he said, as if convincing himself. "Today we mean to set the course of history." A court chamberlain rang an Illyrian crystal alloy gong. Instantly, in response to the sound, the king donned an eager but paternal smile, a practiced, kindly expression that exuded warm confidence. With the fading musical vibrations, he strode down the royal promenade toward his expansive speaking balcony. Out of habit, the king looked at an ultra-clear crystalline mirror mounted in an alcove. He caught his expression, the not-quite-hidden weariness in his eyes, a few new wrinkles that only he could see. How much longer would Basil let him play this role before he passed beyond paternal and into doddering? Maybe the Hansa would let him retire soon. The great solar doors spread open, and the king paused to take a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. Ambassador Otima, the ancient green priest from the forested planet of Therak, stood beside her shoulder-high world tree sapling in its ornate planter. Through the sentient world forest network, Otima could establish an instant communication link with the far-off technical observation platform. He gave one brisk clap of his hands. "It is time. We must transmit a message that I, King Frederick, grant my permission for this wondrous test to begin. Tell them to proceed with my blessing." Otima gave a formal bow. The stern ambassador had so many status tattoos on her face, and her skin was such a weathered green that she looked like a gnarled piece of vegetation herself. She and Basil Wenceslas had butted heads many times, but King Frederick had kept out of the disputes. Otima wrapped her calloused fingers around the scaly bark of the world tree and closed her eyes so that she could send her thoughts via telelink through the trees to her counterpart at Ancier. Chapter 5. Benito Theron. At Ancier, a hush fell over the observers and guests as Benito released his grip on the small world tree. He stroked the treeling, both giving and drawing comfort. "King Frederick sends his blessing. We may proceed," he announced to the crowd. Applause pattered like raindrops. Media troops turned imagers down to the gas giant as if expecting something to happen immediately on the king's command. Dr. Serizawa hurried over to his technician. At his signal, the terminus anchors were launched from orbit. Bright lights shot into the planetary body, tunneling deep to where they would paint a wormhole target far below. The torpedo probes, developed from ancient Cliquist designs, vanished into the cloud decks, leaving not even a ripple. Benito watched, marking every detail which he would pass on through prayer to the eager and curious world forest. Though he was the second son of the Theron ruling family, he served little purpose here at Ancier other than to send instantaneous news of the ambitious test via the world trees, much faster than any standard electromagnetic communication, which even at the speed of light would have taken months or perhaps years to reach the nearest Hansa outpost. Using the interconnected trees, any green priest could communicate with any of his counterparts, regardless of location. Any single tree was a manifestation of the whole world forest, identical quantum images of each other. What one treeling knew, they all knew, and green priests could tap into that information reservoir whenever they chose. They could use it to send messages. Now, while the spectators watched the wormhole anchors disappearing into the Ancier clouds, Benito touched the treeling again. He let his mind melt through the trunk until his thoughts emerged in other parts of the world forest back home. When his eyes focused and he returned to the observation platform, he looked up to see Chairman Wenceslas looking at him expectantly. Benito kept his face calm and dignified. His tattooed features were handsome and noble. His eyes had the vestiges of epicanthic folds, giving them a rounded almond appearance. "My father Idris and mother Alexa offer the prayers of all the Theron people for the success of this test." "I always appreciate kind words from your parents," Basil said, "though I would prefer Therak had more formalized business dealings with the Hansa." Benito kept his voice neutral. "The world forest's plans and wishes do not always match the needs of the Hansa, Chairman. However, you would do better to discuss such matters with my elder brother Reynon, or my sister Sarain. They are both more inclined to business than I." He touched the feathery leaves of the treeling, as if to emphasize his priestly status. "As the second son, my destiny has always been to serve the world forest." "And you do your job admirably. I did not mean to make you uncomfortable. With the support and the benevolence of the world trees, I am rarely uncomfortable." The young man could imagine no other calling. Because of his high-born position, Benito was expected to participate in showy events, such as this spectacle. He didn't want to perform his priestly duties merely for show, however. Given the choice, he would rather have helped to spread the world forest across the spiral arm so the treelings could thrive on other planets. Green priests were few, and their vital telink skills were in such demand that some missionary priests lived in opulent mansions subsidized by the Hansa or colony governments, well paid to send and receive instantaneous messages. Other priests, however, lived a more austere life and spent their time simply planting and tending treelings. That was what Benito would have preferred to do. The Hansa had begged to hire as many green priests as Therak would provide, but the merchants and politicians were constantly frustrated. Although Hanseatic envoys insisted that priests must serve the needs of humanity, Father Idris and Mother Alexa had no interest in expanding their personal power. Instead, they allowed the priests to choose their postings for themselves. Carefully selecting healthy specimens from the sentient forest on Therak, the priests distributed treelings on scattered colony worlds or carried them aboard mercantile ships. More than sunlight and fertilization, the world forest hungered for new information, data to store in its sprawling, interconnected web of half-sentience. The mission of the green priests was to spread the world forest as far and wide as possible, not to serve the Earth-based trading conglomerate. For generations, Hansa researchers had tried to understand instantaneous quantum communication through the interlinked trees, but they had made no progress. Only the world trees could provide telink, and only green priests could communicate through the forest network. The insurmountable problem drove the scientists into a frenzy of frustration. Despite all the technology and manpower the Hansa had poured into the Clickers torch test, none of it could begin without a single mystic priest and his tree. Now, aboard the technical observation platform, Chairman Wenceslas clasped his well-manicured hands in front of him. Very well, Benito. Contact your counterpart at the neutron star. Tell them to open the wormhole. Benito touched the tree again. Chapter 6. Arcus. Halfway across the spiral arm, another green priest waited with 6 Hansa technicians in a small scout ship in a stable spot beyond the gravitational pull of the neutron star. The super-dense stellar remnant was all that remained of a collapsed red giant that had run out of momentum and mass before it could become a black hole. Curling space with its powerful gravity, the neutron star rotated like a searchlight, jets of high-energy particles spraying from its poles like water from a fire hose. Such a tiny ball, less than 10 kilometers across, yet with a celestial powerhouse of energy. Crowded in the ship, the 6 techs were nervous and sweating. The tethered torpedo device had been deployed outside the ship, just waiting to drop into the crushed star's gravitational mouth. The techs stared at Arcus as if the green priest could ease their fears or offer them some sort of shortcut. "Time?" one asked, as if pleading. The treeling beside him had not yet spoken. Arcus sighed. "I will tell you as soon as I hear." Before long he would return to Theroc, where the priests would give him some other duty to serve the world forest. It was all the same to Arcus, though he had chosen this assignment, far away and involving relatively few people. As a green priest he could do nothing else. He was a loner, but he was also a green priest, linked with the forest. If only he could trade with someone who felt more devotion for the task. He clenched the treeling's rough bark, but felt no incoming Talink message. Nothing. More waiting. Not yet. Aboard the cold scout ship, the spaces were too confined, the walls too bare. The stored air tasted of processing filters, with none of the moist richness he was accustomed to breathing in the dense forests. Yet even on Theroc, Arcus felt none of the passion that most green priests did. He might have chosen another life entirely, but now his skin bore the green tinge of symbiosis, a subcutaneous algae that allowed him to photosynthesize bright light. The process was irreversible, and he would always remain linked to the world forest, even if being a green priest was not what he truly wanted. Arcus had become an acolyte to honor a deathbed promise to his father rather than out of his own interest. Green priests were in such demand that even a mediocre one such as Arcus could choose from innumerable offers of employment. On Theroc, the elder green priests helped to make such decisions, and Father Idris and Mother Alexa interacted with the Hansa. But each green priest, even Arcus, could tap into the overall forest mind and make his or her own choices. Among the numerous offers, opulent positions, important diplomatic and liaison posts, Arcus most wanted to be away from all the bustle. He had chosen to be here, in this isolated station. "Time?" another tech said, sounding even more anxious. "Why are they waiting so long?" After communing through Telink, Arcus refocused on the eager technicians. "They say they are ready at Ancier. You may launch the probe now." Working with machinery incomprehensible to the green priest, the Hansa techs scrambled to release the tether and activate the Clickis wormhole generating device. Probes separated from the scout ship and accelerated toward the neutron star, picking up speed as it coasted down the steep space-time slope. The technicians cheered when the anchor point was established close to the beacon of the neutron star. They read off results in a breathless hurry because they didn't know how long the torpedo device could remain in position against the furious gravitational tug-of-war. Arcus watched, filing away images to transmit back to the world trees and all the other green priests. The trees were more interested than he was. "Activate," said the head technician. The torpedo device used ancient Clickis technology to distort, ripple, and then tear a yawning hole in the fabric of space. The maw of the wormhole tunnel was wide enough to engulf the super-dense star. Arcus muttered to the treeling, describing every step of the process until even he became speechless as the new wormhole literally swallowed the blazing neutron star like a pebble falling down a drain. The torpedo generator gave out, its energy exhausted, and the wormhole slammed shut, sealing space-time without leaving a mark in the emptiness that had held the exotic celestial object. There. It is done. Arcus looked to the technicians, who began to cheer wildly. The gauzy remains of the gaseous accretion cloud drifted away like wispy scarves, no longer held in place by chains of gravity. Like a bomb of unimaginable magnitude, the neutron star hurtled toward Ancier. Chapter 7. Margaret Colicos. Lewis adeptly jostled the other observers so he and Margaret could get a ringside seat for the planetary implosion. Basil Wenceslas stood beside them. "We'll know within moments," he said. "The Green Priest says the wormhole has opened on the other side. The neutron star is on its way." Dr. Serizawa, his bald head slick with perspiration, looked from the observation window to the recorders and interviewers. "The receiving end of the wormhole is anchored at the gas giant's core. When the super-dense star hits Ancier, it'll be the most titanic burst of energy mankind has ever unleashed." Then he added quickly, gesturing again, "But don't worry. It'll take hours for the shock wave to travel through the layers of the atmosphere. We're far enough from Ancier that we'll suffer no effects." The incredible mass of the neutron star arrived at the gas giant's metallic core like a cannonball, adding enough mass and energy for ignition. Serizawa saw the readings and cheered. Sunken probe buoys sent pressure, temperature, and photonic readings displayed as violently jumping patterns on the screens. His technicians waved their hands in triumph. Though Ancier's outer skin remained as calm and placid as before, titanic changes were convulsing through the innermost layers. Basil Wenceslas applauded, and the dignitaries followed suit. "The neutron star is much tinier but vastly denser, like a diamond inside a marshmallow. Even now, Ancier's material is falling inward." Serizawa looked at his readings, then at his chronometer. "Within an hour at most, it will achieve the density necessary to begin hydrogen fusion, the energy transport process used in any normal star." Margaret squinted at the spherical finger painting that was assumed to be sun, yet Ancier was so huge that although the neutron star had slammed into the core, she could see no immediate change. Markers and detectors had been deployed at various cloud layers where they would sense the shock wave of outrushing radiation. Margaret leaned forward to kiss Lewis's weathered cheek. "We did it, old man." The two archaeologists had done their work at the beginning. Now they could sit back and watch the end results. Cosmic chaos was even now occurring in the depths. "So, Doctor, just adding all that weight is enough to start the planet burning?" asked a media rep standing behind her. Serizawa replied, "Actually, it's mass, not weight. But no matter. You see, the sudden transfer of the neutron star to the planetary interior gives it an immediate negative energy, potential energy actually. To obey conservation laws, a huge influx of kinetic energy is required, which appears through wormhole thermodynamics as heat. That touches off the reactions to inflate the gas giant into a burning star. It will happen in a snap." His eyes flickered. "Well, within a few days, but you have to put everything in perspective." Normally, heat transport in a star was incredibly slow. Photons took 1,000 years to radiate in a drunkard's walk outward from the core to the surface, impacting with gas molecules along the way, being absorbed and then re-emitted to collide with another gas atom. "Oh, just watch," Serizawa said, "and you'll see what I mean." The fascination of the news media waned within a few hours. The changes were slow, although the gigantic ball was indeed imploding. Detectors deep within the atmosphere showed the nuclear fires spreading outward like a tidal wave. When the wave reached the planetary surface, Ancier would begin to shine like a light bulb. The first flickers of lightning and fire began to show through gaps in storm systems. Pastel discolorations swirled about, displaying titanic upheavals deep below. Margaret's translation of Clickis records had led to this spectacular event, but she didn't know whether to be proud or horrified at what she saw. The Ildiran Septa acknowledged the success of the Clickis torch. Dressed in formal uniform, the alien Adar Korin shuttled over to the observation platform to watch the continuing stellar collapse. Margaret met the Adar with curiosity and trepidation, having never before spoken to an Ildiran. "Your command of English is excellent, Adar. I wish I had such proficiency in languages," Margaret said. "All Ildirans are bound by a common speech, but those of us likely to encounter humans have learned your common trade language. The Mage Imperator requests it of us." Taking advantage of the listener, Lewis talked at great length with Korin, describing their work on the Clickis planets. "The Ildiran Empire has been in existence far longer than humans have explored space, Adar. Why is it, then, that your people have not sent prospectors or archaeologists to learn of this vanished race? Are you not curious?" Korin looked at him as if the question were disconcertingly strange. "Ildirans do not send out solo explorers. When we dispatch a colony of settlers called a splinter, it is a group large enough to continue our society. Solitude is a human trait that we find difficult to comprehend. I would never choose to be so far from other members of my race. My wife likes to be alone so much she often prefers to be in a different section of a dig even from myself." Lewis smiled over at Margaret. Embarrassed, she gave him a slight nod. "I believe, Lewis, that Ildirans all share a faint telepathic link that binds them together, not as a hive mind, but as a support system. Isn't that true, General?" "We call it Thism," Korin said, "and it radiates from our Mage Imperator. He is the knot that binds the threads of our race. If any individual strays too far from the others, that thread might snap. Perhaps humans see traveling alone as an advantage. Conversely, I pity your race for not living within the safety net of the Thism." Korin bowed, his expression unreadable. A scattered murmur of surprised conversation drew them back to the window. A bright plume bubbled up from Ancier like a geyser of superheated gas. The event was unusual, though as it faded, so did the audience's interest. Within an hour, Margaret was the only one watching through the broad window. She found the roiling fury of Ancier hypnotic. The planet glowed now, spreading photons around the still imploding world. She stared at the planet's bright limb, a hazy curve against the backdrop of space opposite from the Ildiran warliners and the observation platform. Suddenly, several incredibly fast spherical objects streaked out like shotgun pellets. They emerged from deep within Ancier's clouds and soared off into open space. Within seconds, the dwindling dots disappeared into the distance. Margaret gasped, but no one near her had seen the apparition. It couldn't possibly be a natural phenomenon. But how could it be anything else? She turned, alarmed and confused. Lewis was still involved in conversation with Adar Korin and Basil Wenceslas, discussing details of their upcoming expedition to Reindik Ko, the numerous Clickis mysteries, the strange robots who still functioned but claimed no knowledge of their creators. Dr. Serizawa stood by his technicians, monitoring endless images of the burning planet. From their expressions, they had obviously seen the apparition too. She went over to them. "What was that, Dr. Serizawa? Did you see—" The man looked at her with a distracted smile. "It will require detailed analysis, naturally, but do not be alarmed. The secondary and tertiary effects of the Cliquis torch are not at all understood. Remember, in the extreme high-pressure cores of a gas supergiant, common gases can be compressed into metals. Carbon is smashed into diamond. He looked back down at the monitors, where the observation platform's imagers replayed the fuzzy recordings. Unfortunately, the strange objects had emerged from the opposite side of blazing Ancien. I would not be surprised if we saw some sort of deep-core metallic nodules, exotic debris ejected in the turmoil after stellar ignition. I would not be overly concerned, Ms. Colicos. The performance of your Cliquis torch has met or exceeded all expectations. Margaret frowned. They looked like ships to me. Artificial constructions. Now Serizawa's expression became somewhat condescending. That would be highly unlikely. After all, what sort of life form could possibly survive within the high-pressure depths of a gas giant planet? Chapter 8. Raymond Aguera. In the Palace District, crowds gathered and cheered, vendors hawked souvenirs, and food preparers sold extravagantly priced treats. A profusion of festival bouquets filled the air with heady perfume, though troops of maintenance workers and gardeners would be sure to remove the flowers before their color and freshness began to fade. Raymond Aguera glided deftly through a forest of elbows and arms. The young man didn't worry about pickpockets because he could sense any dipper, outwit him, and dodge away before the guy could make a grab. Besides, his pockets were empty. Raymond just wanted to see the sights. He was an intelligent and embarrassingly handsome 14-year-old, with dark hair, a thin build, and a bright smile. Raymond had few friends, and even fewer advantages except for the ones he found for himself. A hard life had made him as muscular as a greyhound, which often surprised people who challenged him, though he preferred to talk fast and turn the tables rather than get into a brawl. He ducked and slipped forward so smoothly the front-row spectators didn't even notice a new wide-eyed person standing among them. Because every day was a struggle just to provide for himself, his mother, and his brothers, he paid little attention to politics. But he liked to watch the shows. Overhead, dirigibles, gliders, and balloons carried aloft those who could afford an expensive bird's-eye view of the palace grounds. Gongs were rung, even more deafening than the cheers of the audience. He watched a flurry of bright court uniforms, royal guards, and ministers setting up a speaking stage on the grand balcony of the Whisper Palace. As a unison deacon read a familiar invocation and prayer, salutaires unfurled the brilliant banner of the Terran Hanseatic League, an icon of Earth at the heart of 3 concentric circles. Looking no more impressive than the court functionaries, except for his 2 extravagant robes, an old man stepped ponderously onto the balcony, as if he had taken the time to rehearse every footstep. When the king raised his hands high, the billowing sleeves of his lush garment drooped to his elbows. Flashes of sunlight glittered from the rings on his fingers and the cut flat gems in his crown. Today I speak to you of a great victory for human ingenuity and drive. King Frederick's amplified words boomed from speakers all across the plaza. He heard the rich baritone voice of a deity, deep and resonating. In the Ancien system, we have caused the birth of a new star, which will shine its life-giving warmth and light upon 4 pristine worlds for the settling of humankind. The people cheered again after listening in an awed hush. Raymond smiled at their feigned surprise. Everyone already knew the announced purpose of the gathering. The time has come to light 4 more torches in the Palace District. As the echoes of his voice faded, the king made an extravagant gesture, his hand barely visible even to Raymond's sharp eyesight. On most of the high points, pillars and domes, crackling eternal flames already rose to the sky, as they did from the firefly chains of lampposts on the grounds. Each torch supposedly symbolized the Terran colony world that had signed the Hansa Charter and therefore swore fealty to the old king. "I give you these 4 new moons, which are named after my illustrious predecessors, the first 4 great kings of the Terran Hanseatic League. Then," with a boom, a blazing pillar of fire erupted from the point of a soaring tower on the walking bridge that spanned the Royal Canal. "George, Christopher, and Jack." As he said each name, a new torch bloomed on the top of an unlit tower on the great bridge span. The ice hadn't even melted yet on the 4 moons, and the first terraforming teams wouldn't be landed until the tectonic upheaval stabilized. Still, Raymond delighted along with the audience, watching the king claim a quartet of new worlds. What a grand show! Bands began to play, and mirrorized ribbon chaff twinkled like dandelion fluff through the air, dispersed by drifting zeppelins. King Frederick announced a day of raucous celebration. The population applauded any excuse for reveling. Maybe that was why they all loved their king so much. Frederick hurried back into the quiet comfort of the Whisper Palace, and Raymond noted a bit of concern. The king seemed lonely, perhaps even unhappy, as if tired of living in front of so many eyes all his life. Raymond could sympathize with the monarch, since he himself spent every day completely invisible to the world at large. He wandered among the stalls and souvenir vendors. On the facades of the Whisper Palace, broad friezes showed historical events: the launching of the 11 massive generation ships, the first contact with the Ildirans, who offered their star drive and their galactic civilization. At specific times every hour, the holographic friezes moved, dramatizing the scenes like a glockenspiel. Statues around the fountain parks became animated, stone angels flapped their wings, historical generals rode horses that reared up on cue. A flow of pedestrians streamed across the bridge, entering the palace grounds. Raymond stared at it all, eyes sparkling. He felt the threat, half a second too late. Someone grabbed him by the back of his neck, vice-like fingers squeezing. "So he's here to steal things when the crowd's not watching, but he runs out on us when we have a more sophisticated job to do." Raymond squirmed enough to be able to see the speaker, an older boy with the unfortunate name of Malf, scowled, while his stronger friend Burl clamped the grip even tighter on Raymond's neck. The 14-year-old twisted himself free of Burl's hold, but he didn't run, not yet. "Sorry, but I didn't put stealing on my list of things to do." "Stealing's beneath his delicate sensibilities," Burl said with a snort. "No, it's too easy," Raymond retorted. "Working hard for a living, now that's a challenge. You should try it sometime." Around them, the oblivious spectators danced. Some kissed, many queued up in front of food stands. Malf kept his voice low, but he could have screamed, and few people would have paid attention. Raymond, why don't you just become a deacon if you've got such morality problems, and why couldn't you have just said no, rather than turning us in?" "Crimson Rain, I did say no, Malf, 16 times if I remember right, but you wouldn't listen. Breaking into a man's business and stealing his cash stash is not my idea of a career. You do it once, then it becomes easier to do it again." "I'm all for making it easier," Burl said with a bitter laugh. "It took quite some running to get away from the enforcers after you triggered that alarm." "And if you two were as good as you say, the enforcers would never have gotten close." Raymond wagged his finger at them. "See, I counted on your skill, Malf, and now you're telling me it was all an exaggeration." He drew a deep breath, all of his muscles tensed, ready to sprint off or stay and fight. "I don't suppose you'd believe me if I said it was an accident." Burl clenched his fists and seemed to swell in physical size. "After we beat the crap out of you, maybe you can tell your mommy that was an accident, too." "Leave my mother out of this." With tears in her eyes and gushing with worry for her oldest son, Rita Aguera would make him feel far worse than any bruises. Like a shark scenting blood in the water, Malf moved around, ready to grab Raymond, expecting him to run. Instead, Raymond did the unanticipated. He launched himself toward the larger Burl in a flurry of fists, hard knuckles, and sharp elbows. He fought without finesse, but he used every hard part of his body, from the tips of his boots to the top of his skull, and soon he had knocked a disbelieving Burl down to the flagstones. A whirl and a kick caught Malf in the stomach as the other bully charged toward his intended victim. Enough to stall them, not hurt them. Enough to get away. Raymond dissolved into the crowd before Malf and Burl could recover themselves. He had made his point. Either the two would leave him alone, or they'd come back with reinforcements the next time. Sadly, it would probably be the latter. Chuckling to himself, he sprinted across the bridge, crossing the Royal Canal. He brushed off his drab clothes, relieved to see that he had sustained not a single rip. His knuckles were skinned and his dark hair tousled, but at least he'd gotten out of the tussle without a black eye or any other noticeable injuries. Good enough to convince his mother that nothing serious had happened. She had enough other burdens to bear, and he didn't want to add to them. Raymond was the oldest of 4 boys and the man of the house, since his father had skipped town and signed aboard a colony ship when Raymond was 8 years old. Esteban Aguirre had filed colony papers and a one-sided divorce decree at the same time, so that his wife received the paperwork only after the ship had departed. Raymond's father had gone off to the new colony world of Rama, not because it was a particularly attractive place, but because it had been the first site available. Raymond bade him good riddance. It was time to go home and help his mother with the meals and put his younger brothers to bed. On his way through the palace district, he paused and looked at the lush floral bouquets displayed everywhere. Some had tipped over in the jostle of the crowd. Others would remain standing in their glory for a day or two until the petals began to wilt. Then they'd all be discarded. Despite his compunctions against stealing, Raymond's love for his mother outweighed any qualms about tucking one of the beautiful bouquets under his arm. He hurried home with the extravagant flowers, beaming with pride at how much his mother would enjoy them. The young man did not see the Hansa operatives hired by Basil Wenceslaus. They had been watching Raymond Aguirre all day long. The unobtrusive men took numerous surveillance images of the lone boy and added them to their already detailed file. Chapter 9. Estara. Though she was a daughter of the rulers of Therak, Estara did not know what she was destined to do with her life even at the age of 12. Her 3 older siblings had known from youth that they were expected to learn leadership, enter the green priesthood, train as a commercial ambassador. The 4th child, though, had no set role, so Estara mostly did as she pleased. Full of energy, she ran barefoot into the forest, flitting through the undergrowth beneath the canopy of the always whispering world trees. The ceiling of interlocked palm-like fronds didn't so much block sunlight as filter it, dappling the forest floor in yellows and greens. Leaves and grasses caressed her golden-brown skin, tickling but not scratching. Her large eyes were always eager to make new discoveries and spot unusual objects. Estara had already explored every nearby path, amazed by the world around her. The spunky girl's actions occasionally earned her frowns from her older sister, Sarene, who was enamored of the world of business, politics, and commerce. Estara didn't want to grow up quite so quickly as her sister, though. Reynold, her eldest brother, was already 25 and well on his way to becoming the next father of Therak. Handsome and patient, Reynold studied politics and leadership. By tradition, he had always known he would become the next spokesman for the forest world. In preparation for assuming his impending mantle, Reynold had recently departed on an exciting peregrination to distant and exotic worlds, meeting the major planetary leaders, both human and Ildiran, before his duties chained him to Therak. Estara's parents had never gone to the Ildiran's fabulous capital city of Magistra under the 7 suns, though their daughter, Sarene, 4 years younger than Reynold, had spent several years being schooled on Earth and forging alliances with the Hansa. Estara's brother, Benito, had always been destined to take the green and become a priest of the world forest. She looked forward to his return from Ansir, where he had watched the creation of the new sun. Father Idris and Mother Alexa had indulged her perhaps too much, letting her find her own interests and get into all kinds of trouble. Her little sister, Chelly, the baby of the family, preferred to spend time with her incessantly chattering friends. Astara was much more independent. She ducked beneath sweet-smelling ferns and felt the tingle of wild perfume against her bronze skin. Astara's hair was bunched in a chaos of braids and twists. She preferred this unfashionable style because it left few loose strands to catch on branches and twigs. She trotted along, memorizing the way back home to the towering fungus reef city where she lived. Astara stood under the skyscraper-tall world trees, scaly-barked plants that throbbed with energy, stretching toward the sky as if planted in some giant's garden. Through cracks of the overlapping bark armor, trailing sprouts protruded like loose hairs. The world tree roots, trunks, and rudimentary mind were all connected. The feathery fronds reached hundreds of feet high, drooping to form an umbrella-like awning, each tree touching the next to make the sky a tapestry of foliage. The fronds waved like eyelashes stroking each other. In addition to the humming insect sounds and calls of wild animals, a constant blanket of white noise settled over the forest, a rustling sound as soothing as a lullaby. World trees had spread across all the Theran land masses, and now ambitious green priests carried treelings to other planets so that the interlinked forest sentience could grow and learn. They prayed to it, a throbbing earth spirit in a literal sense, and helped the forest sentience grow stronger. Long ago, 183 years, an Ildiran solar navy patrol had encountered Earth's first slow-moving generation ship, the Kaye, and brought it to this untouched planet. All 11 of the old generation ships had been named for famous explorers. The Kaye had taken its designation from René Caillé, a French explorer of darkest Africa, who had disguised himself as a native in order to enter the mysterious continent. He had become the first white man to look upon the fabled city of Timbuktu. Burton, Peary, Marco Polo, Balboa, Kanaka, those generation ship names had an exotic resonance for Astara, but even tales of Earth's uncivilized days could not match the wonders the widespread colonists had found as they settled other worlds across the spiral arm. Clark, Vichy, Amundsen, Abel Wexler, Stroganov, all of them had found home with the help of the Ildirans, except for the Burton, which remained lost among the stars. The inhabitants of the rescued Kaye had rejoiced upon seeing Therok's verdant landscape, the sheer potential of this untamed world. This new home was more welcoming than any they had imagined during their generations of blind flight in search of any habitable star system. They had lived for centuries, confined aboard a large, sterile starship, and during all that aimless time, the colonists and their descendants had little to do but look at images of forests and mountains. And Therok was everything they had prayed for. The colonists had immediately suspected something unusual about these trees. The Kaye had carried everything necessary to settle even the most hostile world, but Therok proved to be fully cooperative. After the Ildirans deposited them here, the colonists set up prefabricated structures as an immediate and temporary settlement, while biologists, botanists, chemists, and mineral engineers set out to assess what this remarkable world had to offer. Luckily, the biochemistry of the Theran ecosystem was mostly compatible with human genetics, and the settlers were able to eat a great variety of native food. They were not required to engage in massive labors of clearing and fertilizing land. The Kaye settlers found ways to work with the forest, discovering natural homes rather than erecting metal and polymer structures. Decades later, by the time the Ildirans had established diplomatic relations with Earth, the Theran settlers had developed their own culture and established a firm foothold. Although Hansa representatives finally came to reunite them with the greater network of humanity, the Therans were perfectly happy to remain unaligned. When their ancestors had set out on the generation ship, they had never expected to go back, never dreamed of restored contact with Earth. They were a seed cast on the wind, hoping to take root somewhere. They did not intend to be uprooted. As she paused in her explorations, Estara ate messy handfuls of splurt berries and wiped the juice from her mouth and hands. Exuberant, she looked up at the nearest world tree, where she saw handholds and markings of frequent ascents by acolyte reading teams. The bark offered enough bumpy hand and footholds that Estara could scale it like a ladder, providing she didn't look down or think too hard about what she was doing. Up there, the green priests walked their highways across the resilient treetops and interlinked branches. Estara wore few clothes, for the forest was warm. Her feet were calloused enough that she needed no shoes. She ascended one handhold at a time, moving upward, always upward. Exhausted but exhilarated, she finally broke through the brushing world tree leaves. Estara stared out, blinking, into the unobscured sunlight, blue sky, and the endless treescape. Even from up here, she could not tell where one individual tree ended and another began. Around her, she heard voices and songs, groaning chants and hesitant reading voices, a mixture of high-pitched and deep tones. Balanced against the fronds, Estara looked out at the gathered priests, tanned and healthy acolytes who had not yet taken the green, older emerald-skinned priests who had already formed a symbiosis with the world forest. The acolytes sat on platforms or balanced on branches, reading aloud from scrolls or electronic plaques. Some played music. Others simply rattled off tedious streams of data, reciting meaningless numbers from tables. It was a dizzying hubbub of activity, with the priests entirely focused on increasing the knowledge and data held within the world forest, a way to show reverence for and help their vibrant, verdant spirit at the same time. Hundreds of separate voices spoke to the interconnected forest, and the world trees listened and learned. So much to see and experience, and the green priests did it all by staying here, drawing blessings from the mind of world forest. Estara wished she could comprehend everything the forest knew. The priests sang out poems or read stories, even discussed philosophical topics, delivering information in all forms. The world trees absorbed every scrap of data. And still, the living network hungered for more. Chapter 10. Prime Designate Jorah. At the fringe of the sparkling horizon cluster, Ildira basked under the varying light of 7 suns. The Empire's home planet circled a warm orange K1 star that was situated near a close binary pair, the Krona 3 system, composed of a red giant and a smaller yellow companion. More distant, but still dazzling in the Ildiran sky, hung the amazing trinary of Duras, a closely tied white star and yellow star with a red dwarf orbiting the common center of mass. Finally, also distant, the blue supergiant Dame shone like an intense diamond. Night never fell on Ildira. Magistra, capital city and jewel of the ancient empire, glittered under brassy skies. Its spires and domes were made of crystal and colored glass, free-form architecture fashioned out of ultra-strong, transparent polymers. Prime Designate Jorah, eldest son and heir to the Mage Imperator, drew a deep breath of air perfumed with mists from the upward tumbling waterfalls that climbed to the Prism Palace. As was his duty, the Prime Designate waited to meet the human representative from Therock. The young man, Reynald, was Jorah's ostensible counterpart, but in a much diminished capacity. The human prince would become the ruling father of a single wilderness planet, whereas the Prime Designate would eventually control the vast Ildiran Empire. Jorah raised both hands to greet the smiling man. "Prince Reynald, I bid you heartfelt welcome to Migistra." The broad-shouldered prince climbed the wide steps toward the receiving platform, flanked by burly members of the Ildiran soldier keep. A minimal escort of humans accompanied Reynald, including one of his personal green priests. The Theron man had black hair divided into braids that were gathered at the back of his neck. He left his well-muscled arms bare under a padded tunic made from an interesting pearly fabric that glistened in the light of multiple suns. He had a squarish face, flat cheeks beneath wide-set dark eyes. He wore a set of filter lenses to block Ildira's excess sunlight. The receiving committee had also given the visitors creams and screening lotions. "Prime Designate, I've been looking forward to seeing Ildira for many years." Reynald boldly reached out to clasp Jorah's hand as if they were equals. He had a warm and open manner about him, an attitude that melted the icy walls of formal ceremony. Jorah broke into a smile. He liked this young man almost instantly. "Both of our cultures have much to learn from each other." Reynald looked at the shimmering curtains of water that leaped from the foamy pools at the canal edges and climbed invisible suspensor ladders into the domes and connected tubes. He laughed with childish delight. "You have already impressed me, Prime Designate, though I could find a few impressive jungle oddities on Therock if you ever visited us." The Prism Palace stood atop an ellipsoidal hill that raised the Mage Imperator's residence above the shining parapets, museum domes, and greenhouses of Magistra. 7 rivers, long ago tamed by Ildiran engineers, flowed in perfectly straight lines toward the nexus of the Empire. Magnetic levitation fields and gravity-assist platforms nudged the current along, lifting the sparkling water uphill against gravity. Reynald followed Jorah into the entry gallery, where blazers augmented the sunlight to banish every possible shadow. "This is one of the last stops in my peregrination. I decided that I must understand other cultures and worlds in order to serve my people, much like Tsar Peter the Great, one of our ancient leaders from a large country known as Russia. Peter traveled and learned from other cultures and took the best parts back home with him. I intend to do the same." The human's exuberance was infectious. "An admirable goal, Reynald. Perhaps I should leave Magistra more often myself." It wasn't necessary for a Prime Designate to see other parts of the Ildiran Empire, but it might actually be fascinating. His own son and heir, Thor, had spent years fostered on the comfortable Ildiran pleasure world of Hyrilka. "I have already been to Earth, where I met with old King Frederick," Reynald continued with an abashed smile, though he didn't quite know what to do with me. "I also met with Chairman Wenceslas, who was very polite, mainly because he wants me to give him more green priests when I become father of Therock." "And now you have come here," Jorah said, gesturing forward. "We will fill your eyes to bursting." Laughing, he led Reynald and his entourage toward the nearest shimmering wing of the Prism Palace. As the Prime Designate, Jorah was endowed with a charisma and animal magnetism that made him extremely attractive. His lean face radiated charm. His eyes were smoky topaz, gleaming with starry highlights and reflections. Long hair, a sign of male virility among Ildirans, wreathed his head in a mane made up of thousands of thin golden cornrows, braids like delicate chains that were alive and faintly mobile. They writhed with an unusual energy. Human merchants, visiting dignitaries, scholars, even well-to-do tourists came to visit the fabled 7 sons of Ildira. Since the Ildiran Empire had provided the Hansa with a fast star drive, many humans revered them as benevolent patrons, paternal figures. While accepting the human race as part of the galactic story told in the Saga of 7 Sons, many Ildirans had trouble understanding human impulsiveness and drive. But Jorah found this one quite likable. He and Reynauld walked shoulder to shoulder into the promenade hall of arched ceilings and stained glass mosaics. Rich colors vibrated around them, intense light shining through the primary filters of the stained glass windows. Reynauld even spotted a single black Clickhiss robot moving down a corridor on flexible legs, looking like a hulking mechanical beetle, the first one he had ever seen. None of the Ildirans paid it much attention. At court, noble kith women, as well as courtesans, artists, and singers, wore flowing diaphanous gowns with diagonal sashes across their breasts and shoulders. Striped sleeves extended down to the courtesans' knuckles, though they could be retracted into the curving shoulder pads. Reynauld smiled as they entered a large greenhouse banquet hall. "Will I be able to meet the Mage Imperator?" The golden chains of Jorah's hair fluttered of their own accord. He sighed apologetically. "The Mage Imperator of the Ildiran Empire cannot meet with representatives from every human-settled planet. There are so many of them. He's reluctant to give Therak a greater status than other colonies in the Terran Hanseatic League." Reynauld responded stiffly. "Prime Designate, Sovereign Therak is an independent planet, not part of the Huns." Then he smiled. "On the other hand, I think I'd enjoy your company more than your father's anyway." Jorah's star-sapphire eyes twinkled. "And the best part has not yet begun. I've sent for our greatest living historian." Inside one of the palace's many gem-like domes, Jorah gestured to a long table set with 1,000 exotic dishes. Courtesans and servers flocked around them as they took their seats.
Thank you.
The courtesan females were smooth-skinned, hairless, with lovely patterns painted on their faces and long, delicate necks, swirling curves that swept past the alluring eyes to the tops of their heads like flowing waves of water or licking tongues of fire. As the courtesans walked, the fabric of their garments changed color like living rainbows. The women smiled politely at him, but beamed seductively at Jorah. The Prime Designate had their full attention, as if he walked within a fog of pheromones. "You are not married yet, Prince Reynauld? Marriage is the accepted human custom, I believe, especially for royal families." "It is, and no, I have not yet chosen a woman to become Theran mother beside me. There are political considerations as well as romantic ones. On this peregrination I have received several offers of marriage from leaders of some of the Hansa colonies, all respectable, but I prefer to consider a variety of possibilities, since this is such an important decision. I find it incomprehensible to spend so much time choosing a single mate." Jorah selected a plate of jellied fruit, tasted a bite, then offered it to Reynauld, who happily sampled it himself. He raised his gaze to the hovering courtesans. "It is my duty to have as many lovers as possible and father numerous children who carry the Mage Imperator's bloodline. Committees and assistants aid me in choosing among the thousands of candidates and verify their state of fertility when I mate with them." "Sounds exhausting," Reynauld said, "and not terribly erotic." "A Prime Designate has his duties to suffer." Jorah chose a bowl of his favorite sliced fruits and steaming syrup. "The Ildiran people consider it a great honor to breed with me, and I have more volunteers than I can possibly service in my lifetime. Everything will change for me when I succeed my father and become Mage Imperator." "That must be exciting," Reynauld said. Jorah wore a contemplative expression. "At that time I must undergo a ritual castration ceremony." Reynauld looked shocked, as the Prime Designate knew he would. "Only in that way can I become the focus for the Thism and see through the eyes of my race. I will give up my manhood and become a demigod, all-seeing and all-knowing. A fair enough exchange, I suppose." Reynauld dabbed his lips with a formal napkin. Think I will endure my own problems of selecting a wife. I don't envy yours." Servants whisked away the myriad untouched dishes when it was clear the two men were sated. Jorah clapped his hands. "It is time for our rememberer." A small, older-looking Ildiran entered the room wearing loose robes. He wore no gems, no facial adornment, no jewelry on his fingers or wrists. His face looked more alien than most of the Ildiran kiths, with fleshy lobes growing around his brow and cheeks, sweeping back along his hairless head. "Rememberer Vaosh is a historian in the Ildiran court," Jorah said. "He has entertained me many times." Vaosh bowed, and Reynold nodded a welcome, not sure how to receive a rememberer, whether with an outthrust hand or with applause. Jorah continued. "Our rememberers excel in performing portions of our Saga of the Seven Sons." "Yes, I've heard of your race's legends," Reynold said. Vaosh spread his arms so that the sleeves of his robe flowed. "Far more than just a set of scriptures and stories. The Saga is the grand epic of the Ildiran people. It is the framework by which we fit into the universe. Ildiran history is not just a sequence of events, but a genuine story, and we are all part of its intricate plot." He swept an outstretched hand toward Reynold. "Even a human prince such as you is included. Every person has a role to play, whether as a minor character or a great hero. Each of us hopes to live a life so significant that it will be remembered in the ever-growing saga." Jorah leaned back in his chair. "Entertain us, Vaosh. What story will you tell today?" "The tale of our discovery of the humans is most appropriate," Vaosh said, widening his expressive eyes. He proceeded to speak in a captivating voice, in a rhythm that was more than poetry, yet less than song. Vaosh summarized the familiar events of how the deteriorating Earth civilization had sent out 11 enormous generation ships that flew blindly toward nearby stars, each vessel filled with pioneers. Reynold was amazed at the tone of the historian's voice and at how his lobes flushed and changed color to display a palette of emotions. "Such glorious desperation, such hope, optimism, or foolishness. Yet the Ildiran Solar Navy found you." Vaosh folded his hands. When Vaosh finished the tale of the humans' rescue, Reynold applauded loudly. Jorah, delighting in the strange custom, clapped his hands as well. Soon all of the courtesans and functionaries in the banquet hall slapped their hands together, making a deafening noise. Vaosh's face colored, as if he didn't know how to react. "I told you he was a master rememberer," the Prime Designate said. Reynold gave a wry smile. "How ironic that Ildiran rememberers are the best ones to tell our story." Chapter 11. Adar Korin. Though he commanded all the ships in the Ildiran Solar Navy, Adar Korin still felt his chest grow cold with awe whenever he stepped into the presence of Mage Imperator Kairok. The deified ruler saw everything, knew everything, touching each Ildiran through his tendrils of telepathic phism. And still he wanted to see Adar Korin. The ceremonial septa of warliners had returned from Ancier after having observed the astonishing Clickis torch. He had already transmitted images and reports, but now the Mage Imperator wanted the words directly from his lips. Korin could not refuse the command. Bronn, the Mage Imperator's hulking personal bodyguard, moved behind the Adar. Since he was a member of the warrior kith, Bronn's features were more bestial than those of other Ildirans. His hands sported claws, his mouth showed long, sharp teeth, and his large eyes could detect any movement, any threat to his revered leader. Adar Korin, of course, posed no threat, but the chief bodyguard was incapable of lowering his state of alert. The Mage Imperator's private antechamber was hidden behind opaque walls at the rear of the sky sphere, the nucleus for the Prism Palace's many spires, domes, and spheres. Corin stepped into the lambent illumination of blazers, where the enormous Mage Imperator waited for him, reclined in his chrysalis chair. Bronze sealed the doors. Despite his impressive rank, the Adar had rarely spoken alone to the Mage Imperator without an audience of advisers, attenders, bodyguards, and nobles. Mage Imperator Kairak was like a male queen bee, a single being who could direct and experience his whole civilization from within the Prism Palace. He was the focal point and recipient of the thism which made him the heart and soul of all Ildirans. But often, as now, the leader needed more precise details and eyewitness analyses. Corin clasped his hands in front of his heart in prayer and supplication. "Your summons honors me, liege. And your service honors all Ildirans, Adar." The Mage Imperator had already shooed away the constant diminutive attenders who pampered him, oiled his skin, massaged his feet. His eyes were hard and impenetrable, his voice edged like a razor. "Now we must talk." Nestled in his bed-like chair, covered in draping robes, the leader was large and soft. His fleshy skin hung in pale folds, his hands and legs weakened from lack of use. After his ritual castration many decades earlier, Mage Imperator Kairak looked vastly different from his handsome eldest son, Prime Designate Jorah. By tradition, his feet never touched the floor. Before renouncing the calls of the flesh, Kairak had sired many children. As the paternal figure of the Ildiran race, he maintained an extraordinarily long braid, the cultural symbol of virility. The braid hung down from his head, across his shoulder and chest, draped like a thick hemp rope that twitched and flickered with faint nerve impulses of its own. A Mage Imperator could live for 2 centuries after he became the nexus of the Thism and the repository of Ildiran knowledge. Kairak had not deigned to walk for decades, allowing the rest of the Ildiran race to be his eyes and hands and legs. He had too much self-importance to be bothered by such things. Resting in his enormous cradle chair, he directed his attention toward the Adar. Corin adjusted his uniform again, glad that he had taken the time to apply all the medals and ribbons, though very little could impress the great leader. "Tell me what you witnessed at Ancier. I am already aware that the Terrans have ignited the planet, but I require your objective assessment. How much of a threat does this Clickis torch pose to the Ildiran Empire? Do you believe the Hanseatic League means to use it as a weapon against us?" A thrill went through Corin. A war against the Ildiran Empire? I don't believe the humans are such fools, liege. Consider the sheer size and power of our solar navy. The Mage Imperator's eyes gleamed. "Nevertheless, we must not ignore their ambitions. Tell me about Ancier." The Adar spoke in gruff sentences, giving clear facts with occasional opinions or interpretations. Corin had been bred to become a military officer, but he was not a rememberer, and his stories were simply recountings of what had happened, not entertaining legends to amuse great men. The Mage Imperator lounged on his platform, listening. His intelligent face was doughy, his cheeks round, his chin little more than a button swallowed in soft skin. His expression was beatific enough that some humans had compared it to the face of Buddha. He wore a timeless look of peace, confidence, and benevolence, but the Adar sensed a hardness of necessary cruelty hiding beneath the surface. "So the event went precisely as the humans anticipated?" "Except for one mystery." Corin hesitated. "I must show you some images we acquired, liege." He removed a recording chit from his uniform belt and inserted it into a portable displayer that he held in both palms. While feigning minimal interest, our warliners imaged every moment of the planetary collapse. Then, as Ancier was engulfed in stellar flames, we saw this. Emerging from the deep cloud decks and racing away from the newborn sun, strange, spherical objects glittered as if their skins were made of diamond. The transparent globes streaked away from the flaming clouds, moving faster than even an Ildiran star drive could propel them. The Mage Imperator recoiled, his face expressing astonishment, even a glint of fear. "Show it to me again." His dark eyes were intent, hungry. These objects came from within the gas planet, Liege. They are unlike any phenomenon ever encountered in my experience, certainly not any sort of spacecraft. I have read pertinent sections of the Saga of the Seven Suns, and scoured through other relevant records, but I have learned nothing. Do you know what this could mean, Liege? I know nothing whatsoever about it. The Mage Imperator seemed angry, on the verge of an explosion, but he said nothing more. Corin had seen shock and recognition on the Mage Imperator's face, and he wondered why the great leader would hide such information. But he also knew with utter certainty that no Mage Imperator would ever lie to his subjects, so he dismissed his doubts as a simple misinterpretation. He bowed. That is my full report, Liege. Shall I distribute images of these strange objects to my other officers, so that we may better keep watch? No, there is no need. The Mage Imperator's voice left no room for discussion. We must not overreact to a minor mystery. The leader stroked his long, twitching braid where it lay across his belly. He propped himself up so that he could look directly into Corin's face, as if he had suddenly come to a decision. His tone became less intense, more conversational as he changed the subject. For now, I have another important mission for you, one that cannot wait. Corin clasped his hands in front of his chest again. As you command, Liege. You and the Solar Navy must rescue our splinter colony on Krena. Bring them home to Ildira. Surprised, Corin straightened again. What has happened? He couldn't keep the hopeful sound out of his voice. Is this to be a military operation? He had read many stories in the saga and wanted to have his own part, however small, in an epic conflict. Krena was barely large enough to be a true splinter, and now they are suffering from a terrible plague, which has already killed a substantial portion of the colonists, including my Krena designate. Through the Thism, I have felt their suffering. The sickness first blinds its victims, then kills them. Klarbech. Adar Corin felt cold. That is terrible, Liege. The braid twitched again. Since the colony has dropped below the critical population density for Thism to function, I have decided to abandon it. Rather than assigning more and more colonists to this hazardous place, we will remove our people. It shall be done, Liege, Corin said, rapidly and efficiently. I hope we can act quickly enough to prevent further loss of life. Are we to recover our equipment and buildings? No. They are tainted with the disease. Also, the Terran Hanseatic League has bargained hard and negotiated well, and they have acquired Krena and all its resources from us. Their preliminary tests have made them confident they are not susceptible to this plague. Humans will move into the empty settlement as soon as our people have been evacuated. Corin was aghast, especially after having seen the outrageous experiment at Ancier that would provide them with 4 new moons to inhabit. What could the humans possibly need with a new planet? They have already spread like a disease across so many worlds. It is all part of my plan, Adar. Better to let them have our leavings than to let them grow too ambitious on their own. Adar Corin nodded. It is as I have warned for decades, Liege. We must never let down our guard. I suggest we maintain a careful vigilance. I always do, my Adar, said the Mage Imperator. I always do. Chapter 12. Relinda Kett. As a successful merchant with 5 ships, Relinda Kett was not accustomed to biting her nails and waiting in meek silence, especially during an ambush. She stood next to General Kurt Lanyon on the bridge deck of the Juggernaut-class battleship, the most heavily armed vessel in the Earth Defense Forces. While lurking in the empty silence of space, Lanyon had ordered the Juggernaut to shut down all its running lights and dampen their electromagnetic signature. The EDF battleship's dark hull plates of stealth material would keep them invisible, just a gravitational anomaly floating among the rocks at the outskirts of the Wairika system. Waiting. They had already set their trap. "How long have we been in position?" Relinda said in a quiet voice. "No need to whisper, madam," the general answered. His cheeks and chin were so smooth and clean that the skin looked slippery. When he focused his attention, his close-set, icy blue eyes seemed to drink in light and then reflected back twofold. Lanyon indicated the tracker screen that showed the blip of Relinda's cargo ship, the Voracious Curiosity, as it proceeded along the commercial flight path toward Wairika's inhabited planets. "We can't hurry this. That bastard Sorengard has to make the next move. You'd best be certain to respond the moment he does, General." Now that she no longer bothered to whisper, her booming voice carried an intimidating quality. "That's my personal ship out there, and it's being piloted by my favorite ex-husband." "Your favorite one, madam? How many of them do you have?" "Ships or ex-husbands?" "Ex-husbands," the general growled as if she should have known his intent. "I'm already aware of how many ships you run." 5 ex-husbands, and Bebob is the best of the bunch, the only one who still works for me." She still got along with Captain Branson, Bebob Roberts, personally and sexually. Besides, he was a damn good captain. Space corsairs, led by the outlaw Rand Sorengard, had recently captured one of Relinda's merchant ships in the Wairika run, killing the crew and taking all of her supplies. Settled by one of the original generation ships, the Abel Wexler, Wairika was near the edge of territory claimed by the Ildiran Empire, far from the core of the Terran Hanseatic League, which meant that neither race provided much surveillance or protection. But when Sorengard's corsairs had taken to running down cargo ships, the Earth Defense Forces had vowed to root out and crush such flagrant lawlessness, even if it meant using Relinda's ship and her favorite ex-husband as bait. Relinda was a black woman with an ample body, a big appetite, and a hearty laugh. She allowed people to draw their own stereotypes, which often led them to underestimate her. Relinda was not quite as soft and roly-poly as she appeared. A shrewd businesswoman, she understood her markets and knew 1,000 special niches. Other traders wasted their time looking for big strikes and monopolies on rare alien goods, but she preferred to make herself rich one small step at a time. Many merchants failed to pay off their vessels, but Relinda had 5 ships, 4 now that Sorengard's asshole pirates had captured the Great Expectations. The Wairika run had been one of her company's most lucrative routes, since the outlying colonists needed many essentials that Relinda could provide at low cost. Now, though, with Sorengard preying upon helpless vessels, few traders would venture into the area. Relinda could have gouged even higher prices from the needy colonists. Instead, she preferred to take this risk, allowing General Lanyon to use her Voracious Curiosity as a bit of provocation. She wanted to make a profit, certainly, but she also wanted business to run smoothly. Most of all, she intended to see justice done for her lost captain, Gabriel Mesta, and his crew. Sitting in command aboard the giant Juggernaut, General Lanyon didn't have such high-minded ideals or moral reasons. He just wanted to kick some butt and teach these pirates a lesson. Run by the Hansa, the EDF served as a combination police-security force, as well as a standing interstellar military. Unlike the Ildiran Solar Navy, whose large and ornate ships were mainly for show, blustering about and doing humanitarian deeds, Lanyon's EDF was more realistic in its purpose. They knew there would always be plenty of trouble among the Hansa colonies. Humans had never ceased to fight one another, finding religious or political reasons to squabble. When that justification failed, they simply grabbed one another's possessions or resources. Stopping a rebel like Sorengard, a man who had connections with the gypsy-like roamers, now that was a perfect mission for the EDF. Sorengard's pirates were also said to be roamer exiles, all of which added to the Hansa's already prevalent suspicion against the gypsy people. Though the unruly nomads supplied most of the star drive fuel used in commerce, the roamers obeyed no law but their own and generally avoided participating in the political or social activities of other civilized humans. "Picking up energy signatures, General," said a tactical lieutenant at her station. "A dozen of them, small ships apparently, but they seem to be carrying heavy weapons." "Battle stations," Lanyon said, "and keep running silent until I give the order." Soldiers scrambled about, and pilots raced to the launch decks to board their fast attack remoras. Rolinda clenched her fists and drew deep breaths, thinking of Bebop. Her captain would be flying down toward Wairika, hoping to flush out the corsairs so the EDF could stop the pirates' depredations. Rolinda wanted to open a channel and shout a warning, but that would ruin the ambush. She prayed Bebop would be safe. She watched as the unsuspecting corsairs ignited their engines and moved in toward their prey. Smiling, Lanyon opened the intercom channel to give orders to his soldiers. The general was too damned cocksure. After the corsairs closed in on the voracious Curiosity, Bebop did his best to fly evasive maneuvers toward the safety net of Wairika stations, but the overloaded cargo ship was full of material to make up for what had not been delivered during the last scheduled run. Bebop's moves were sluggish. Rolinda knew her captain must even now be panicked, sweating and swearing. Branson Roberts was not simply acting as bait, he was genuinely trying to escape, but he had no chance against the corsairs. Her heart went out to him. "You'd better not blow this, General, or I'll have your balls." "Thank you for the vote of confidence, madam," he said, then shouted into the intercom, "All remoras, launch! Manta cruisers, proceed forward. Engage the enemy." Even as the greedy corsairs surrounded the single merchant ship, the EDF battle fleet pounced upon them. The squadron of fast attack remoras lunged in, targeting the pirates' unshielded engines. The corsairs were brave enough to face the minimal defensive capabilities of merchant ships, but they had no way of resisting the battle-ready Terran military force. One of the small corsair ships broke away and tried to flee. Accelerating so hard, its white-hot engine cowlings began to vaporize into plasma, causing the pirate to veer off in an unstable flight path. With several jazer blasts, 2 remoras destroyed the fleeing corsair before he could slip out of detector range. Lanyon shouted into the ship-to-ship comm, "I want them alive! Don't fry them unless you have no choice!" A chorus of acknowledgments came over the speakers, and then the mid-sized Manta cruisers joined the fray. Flying fast, the remoras opened fire with concentrated jazer pulses, and all hell broke loose. Fed up with standing on the sidelines, Rolinda ran to the communications console and with one big shoulder knocked Lanyon out of the way. She adjusted the frequency to the voracious Curiosity's private channel. "Bebop, get your ass out of there. If I don't see you moving out of the firing zone in 5 seconds, I'm going to come over there and do it myself." "Don't need to tell me twice, Rolinda," Bebop's surprisingly firm voice answered, but she knew he was just putting on a brave mask. Branson Roberts could be cool in a crisis, but he was not a boulder-headed hero in training. The voracious Curiosity changed course to head down the Z-axis below Wairika's ecliptic and away from the battle zone. Not a scratch from a stray blast or a ricochet. Rolinda breathed a sigh of relief, but told herself it was only because she wanted the Curiosity to be clean and undamaged for her upcoming trip to Tharok. The Mantas crippled the pirate ships, and remoras rounded up the vessels in short order. One EDF pilot scorched his hand when a control panel sparked out due to a malfunction that had been missed during the recent inspection overhaul. That man became Lanyon's sole casualty. The Corsairs' hodgepodge of ships hung corralled within the surrounding barricade of EDF vessels. The spacecraft looked old and patched, strange designs assembled from mismatched components and mixed-up blueprints. Their hulls were scarred, their engines damaged in the recent fight. "I want all prisoners shuttled over to my Juggernaut," Lanyon said. "Bring them to the cargo bay. Make sure you put neural clamps on their wrists and strip them of all weapons." Next, EDF soldiers began the most dangerous part of the operation, boarding the 9 remaining Corsair vessels and taking prisoners. While they removed the pirate crews, leaving the ragtag vessels guarded by designated troops, one Corsair captain initiated a critical overload, attempting to blow up his vessel and vaporize any EDF forces within range. But the botched self-destruct routine succeeded only in melting down the engine core, burning through the hull, and shooting out a narrow jet of fire. The unexpected venting made the Corsair ship careen out of control like a whirligig until it finally sputtered out and drifted in space, dark and ruined, not even worth the salvage. Verlinda accompanied General Lanyon to the Juggernaut's cargo bay, where 31 prisoners were brought forward. The men stood helpless, with angry eyes and tattered shirts, hands bound, rich in dignity but poor in common sense. "Which one is Rand Sorengard?" Lanyon swept his ice-blue eyes across them, working his jaw to contain his indignation. "And don't play any stupid tricks. You'll all face the same punishment anyway." The men glanced at each other, trying to look haughty, jaws clenched, eyes blazing. Several of the pirates appeared ready to step forward in a foolish attempt at bravery, but a tall, lantern-jawed man volunteered first. He looked at the others with the sure, confident gaze of a leader. "You men stand down, I'll face my own crimes." He turned to Lanyon. "I'm Rand Sorengard. I don't recognize your authority to arrest me." "Oh, are you trying to hurt my feelings? Maybe you'd better make your excuses to this lady here." The general put a hand on Relinda's shoulders. "You stole one of her ships and killed her crew. Did you ask those people if they recognized your authority?" "We were acquiring needed resources," Sorengard said. "You call us pirates, and yet the big Hansa Goose has imposed tariffs and trade restrictions on anything the roamers import and export. You people simply wrap your thievery in political nicety." Lanyon's lips formed a grim line. "Then let's put an end to any further nicety." Out here on the fringes of the Hansa, the general had the authority to use whatever methods he deemed necessary. "Some of your Corsairs saw fit to take their own lives during capture. I can't argue with that. Now I will pronounce my own sentence upon the rest of you. First, you've been caught red-handed in the act of piracy. Moreover, the evidence clearly shows you are guilty of murdering the captain and crew of the Great Expectations, and probably other ships as well." He gestured toward the access airlock hatches at the far end of the cargo bay. Those chambers were used for space combat troops after suiting up and engaging their personnel weapons to exit from the battleship and proceed to zero-G combat exercises. "Your punishment is death, swift and sure, with no malice, and as painless as I can reasonably make it." Though the sentence made her heart heavy, Relinda was not surprised. The Corsairs didn't even argue, simply glared at General Lanyon. "Because the rest of you have made the mistake of following Rand Sorengard, he will be the one to dispense your sentence. Each of you, one by one, into the airlock. Sorengard, you will eject them into space." "I will not." The pirate leader raised his lantern jaw. "Torture me as much as you will, but I refuse to be your pawn." One of the Corsairs spoke up. "Do it, Rand. I'd rather have you push the button than one of these filthy eddies." The other pirates muttered agreement. 3 spat on the deck, trying to hit Lanyon, but missing by at least a foot. One man broke away from the line and moved toward the airlock hatches. "Don't let them gloat, Rand. This is the only choice they'll let us have." The pirate leader looked at his captured crewmen and seemed to see what he expected to find in their expressions. Then he turned back to the general. "This is no victory for you." The first man went to the hatch, but Relinda couldn't decide whether he was the bravest of them all or if he felt it might be worse watching the others die before him. A uniformed soldier opened the airlock hatch, gesturing inside as if he were a formal maitre d'. "We could do 2 or 3 at once, General," said a lieutenant. "No," both Lanyon and Rand Sorengard answered in unison. "Flung out into space," the first man muttered, but his voice didn't quiver with fear. "I guess that's the closest a roamer will get to going home." "Go find your guiding star," Sorengard said. The soldier sealed the hatch shut, and Melinda turned away, not wanting to look through the window plate. Though she hated what these pirates had done to her ship, her innocent crew, she couldn't watch the air being drained away. Explosive decompression would cause the man's soft tissues to burst before his lungs and his blood began to boil and freeze at the same time. Rand Sorengard muttered a prayer or a farewell under his breath, and then hammered the release button without hesitating. The first of the captured corsairs was gone. Cold and horrified at the brutal justice, Rolinda spoke quietly to Lanyon, who stood at attention as if he didn't want to be disturbed. "You've made your point, General. Is that not sufficient?" "No, it is not, madam. The sentence is just, and you know it." He watched as the second pirate was manhandled into the airlock and the hatch sealed behind him. "Space is vast, and lawlessness can grow unmanageable if left unchecked. My mission is to respond with sufficient vehemence to provide a credible deterrent." He looked at the colorful, exotic clothing the corsairs wore, and stared out at the view screens. In space, the mismatched and weirdly modified pirate ships hung together, manufactured to the roamer's own strange specifications. His teeth pressed together as if he didn't want the insulting words to come out of his mouth. Damned roachers. After all the corsairs had been similarly executed, General Lanyon himself ejected Rand Sorengard from an airlock hatch, then turned to his Remora pilots standing in the Juggernaut launching bays. "One more step to go, men. Scout the vicinity and gather all the frozen bodies. Bring them back inside so we can incinerate them properly." He looked over at Rolinda Kett. "We're in close proximity to a shipping lane here. No sense in leaving navigation hazards." Chapter 13. Jess Tamblyn. Riding the lemony-tan clouds of Golgan, the Romer sky mine left a wide wake as it scooped up misty resources. The Harvester Complex, a sprawling cluster of reactor chambers, gathering funnels, storage tanks, and separable living quarters, was similar to hundreds of other sky mines run by the nomadic roamers above gas giant planets across the spiral arm. The extended clans operated on the fringe of the Hanseatic League, aloof and independent. Families captained their own sky mines or operated resource stations in the detritus of planets no one else wanted. Romer sky mines harvested vast amounts of hydrogen from gas planets, giant reservoirs of resources accessible for the taking. They ran millions of gaseous tons through ecti reactors using an old Ildiran process. Through catalysts and convoluted magnetic fields, the reactors converted ultra-pure hydrogen into an exotic allotrope of hydrogen, ecti. Ildiran star drives, the only known means of faster-than-light travel, depended on ecti as their power source. Huge amounts of hydrogen were needed to create even minimal quantities of the elusive substance. Because of their close family ties and their willingness to operate on the edge, roamers were able to provide ecti more cheaply and reliably than any other source. The dispersed clans had successfully exploited the commercial niche. More successfully, in fact, than anyone in the Hansa realized. After Jess Tamblyn's cargo escort docked with the Blue Sky mine, the hatches were locked down, airlocks connected, bolts secured. The cargo escort was little more than a spider-like frame of engines and a captain's bubble. When the framework was fastened to the Sky Mine's storage tanks, Jess could pilot containers of condensed ecti to distribution centers. Even performing a trivial job like this, he always did his best, going beyond what was expected of him, setting a good example. When all the indicator lights glowed green, he formally requested permission to come aboard his brother's Sky Mine. The Romer workers teased Jess until he entered a set of override commands and stepped aboard anyway. He shrugged back his hood, patted down his many pockets, then gave a shake of his shaggy brown hair. "So if you recognize me, where's the red carpet?" One of the production engineers, a gruff, middle-aged man from the Burr family, gave a good-natured curse. Shiz, you've been promoted to cargo driver, I see. Does that mean you've had a fight with your father? Jess flashed a rakish smile. I can't let my brother get into all the disagreements with my family. He was handsome, blue-eyed, with a vibrant personality that made him appear energetic and relaxed at the same time. Besides, somebody competent has to take the load to the distribution ships. Can you think of a better pilot? The Bear engineer waved a dismissive hand. You're just shuttling Ekti to the Big Goose. They wouldn't know a good pilot from a blind farmer. The deprecating reference to the Hansa came from the original albatross-like configuration of the early Terran trading ships, meant to look like eagles but shaped more like fat geese. The name of the Hansa chairman who had tried to make the gypsy colonists sign the Hansa Charter, Bertram Goswell, had added further inspiration. Roamers found the term to be suitably insulting. Jess shrugged. No matter, I like to find excuses to see my brother, make sure he's not making too many mistakes. He didn't say out loud that he also seized upon any legitimate reason to escape the stern scrutiny of his father. Old Bram Tamblin layered heavy pressures and responsibilities upon Jess now that his older brother was no longer welcome as a member of the clan. The young man held on to those expectations as an anchor and never put his own wishes forward, even if old Bram rarely noticed. As the cumbersome facility cruised along through Golgan's clouds, workers tended the Ekti reactor controls, checked the distribution pipes, and lubricated mechanical systems that needed constant maintenance. Jess walked through the cargo bay, listening to the comforting hisses and hums, the industrial music made by all sky mines. He loved being here. Blue sky always seemed to be cleaner and more polished than any other sky mine. Jess's brother Ross was immensely proud of what he had accomplished here. Jess trudged down the corridor, needing no help in finding the captain's deck. Even on the work shift, roamers wore colorful, many-layered outfits composed of scarves, billowing sleeves, hoods, and hats. Every tunic, vest, and set of trousers was adorned with frills of pockets and pouches, clips, chains, and hooks for storing 1,000 gadgets, testing devices, or hand weapons. The clips kept tools in place and readily at hand, even in the low-gravity environments where roamers spent a great deal of their time. "How long you staying, Jess?" asked a shift supervisor who came forward through the bulkhead from his office chamber. "Less than a day. We've got a supply run and a quota to meet. Obligations, you know." The supervisor nodded. "We'll tune up your cargo escort and link all the struts to the Ekti tank." "Is Ross outside on the deck sightseeing again?" "No, I think the chief's in the navigation bubble." "What's he worried about hitting in this big open sky?" Shaking his head, Jess scrambled up the interdeck ladder until he found the navigation bubble. Though Ross had forever turned his back on the family water industry on Plumas, Jess always felt welcome here on his older brother's facility. Placing his hands on his hips, he stared at the back of Ross's head. His brother was intent on the controls, peering into the clouds of the planet's incomprehensibly vast and open sky. Vaporous convection currents rose up and tumbled down as the sky mine continued along its random path. An asterisk symbol had been painted above the navigation panel. It was the guiding star, which the roamers believed directed the paths of their lives. "Afraid of crashing into an angry concentration of nitrogen? Or do you just like sitting in the captain's chair and driving this big hulk nowhere?" Ross spun, and his face lit up in a smile. "Jess, I wasn't expecting you. Decided to save you the wages of a cargo hauler." He came forward to embrace Ross. "Help you pay off that big debt. Just another part of my responsibility as your little brother." Ross indicated the sensor panels. "For your information, there's an art and a skill to piloting a sky mine. I still have to adjust course, raise or lower the ship. A good captain always watches for dense concentrations of gases." The sky mine trailed a squid-like network of probes. The kilometers-long threads drifted in the clouds, picking up data and helping Ross decide where to go. Golgan's atmospheric gases were rich with just the right mix of elements and catalysts for the Ildiran reactors to produce Ekti. Also, The gas giant was close to star trading lanes, which allowed for easy distribution of the fuel. After years of hard work, Ross was close to making a profit from his operation, despite their father's constant pessimism. "I presume you've brought gossip?" Ross paused, and added ironically, "And of course a sincere apology from Dad begging me to come home." Jess laughed. "If I'd brought that, I'd be here with a full Romer celebration fleet, such as the Spiral Arm has never seen." Ross gave him a bittersweet laugh. "One of us is still off course from the guiding star. Let's go up on deck. I want to be out in the fresh air." They climbed through hatches, took a lift, and finally passed through a set of wind doors to a broad observation deck. The deck could be surrounded by an atmosphere field, but for now it was open to the sky itself. Ross frequently took the blue sky mine down to an equilibrium level where the clouds were thick enough to be breathable, and Golgan's atmosphere was warmed by internal thermal sources. Jess drew a deep breath of the alien air. "This isn't something I get to do every day." "I do," Ross said. The Blue Sky Mine, like all Romer-designed factories, was composed of three main segments: the intake feed tanks, the processing reactors and exhaust funnels, and the Ecti storage spheres. As the Sky Mine plowed through the atmosphere, open nozzles sucked in raw gases and delivered them through processing machinery. After passing through the catalytic reactors, the rare hydrogen allotrope was siphoned off, while the waste gases spilled back out from the hot stacks. Ecti was the only known allotrope of hydrogen, though other elements had varying molecular forms. Carbon manifested itself as powdery graphite, crystalline diamond, or exotic polymer spheres of Buckminster fullerene. Long ago, the Ildirans had discovered how to reconfigure hydrogen into a fuel that allowed their star drives to function. Before ambitious Romers took over the Ecti harvesting industry, old Ildiran model cloud trawlers had been much larger, hosting a minimal splinter community of 60 to 90 family units and requiring a gigantic infrastructure. Therefore, harvesting Ecti had cost the gregarious Ildirans a great deal. Independent Romers, on the other hand, could operate sky mines with a small support staff, which also allowed them to sell star drive fuel at lower cost. The Ildirans had gladly surrendered their monopoly on Ecti production, glad to leave the desert islands in space and let humans have the misery to themselves. The rest of the Hansa considered the Romers to be little more than gypsy space trash, disorganized and disreputable. No one had an inkling of how much the clans actually had and how many taxes they avoided, since they kept such information hidden from outsiders. A flutter of white wings went past Jess's face, startling him. He looked up to see a dozen doves flapping around the deck, swirling out into the sky and circling back to their perches and feed bins. "I'd forgotten about the birds." "This is a perfect place for them. Look how far they can fly." "Yes, but where do they land?" Ross rapped his knuckles on one of the railings. "Back here." Clouds extended for 1,000 miles below them, but neither Ross nor Jess felt dizzy. They have nowhere else to go, so they always return. The best sort of cage. Fastening his insulated jacket against the chill, Ross gazed across the infinite distance like a feudal lord surveying his domain. Jess pulled up his hood against the breeze. Behind them, exhaust plumes boiled upward like thunderheads that rapidly dispersed into the cloud decks of Golgan. The two brothers stood side by side in comfortable silence. During the lull in conversation, Jess sensed it was time for his gifts. He opened one of the pocket pouches on his right thigh and withdrew a thick golden disc engraved with symbols that matched the Tamblin clan markings embroidered on Jess's and Ross's clothing. "Tasia made this for you." Ross took it, looking with wonder at the beautiful device his younger sister had created. "As usual, I'm impressed by her engineering skills, but I'll need to know what it is before I can use it." Jess pointed to the dial and the numbers. "It's a compass. It can be normalized to any planet's magnetic field so you can always find your way. See, there's the guiding star. Is my little sister implying that I'm lost? It's just her way of showing that she misses you, Ross, though you'd never get through her tough girl act long enough for her to admit it. Ross's grin grew. Yeah, I miss her too. Jess reached into a second pocket and pulled out a small bound book with yellowed pages, most of which were blank, though some were covered with faded handwriting. An old-fashioned logbook used by sea captains to keep track of their journeys. It's from Dad. Ross slid the compass into one of his pockets and held the red leather-bound book with a combination of awe and skepticism. This is from Dad? He flipped through the pages, looking at the handwritten words, then raised his gaze to meet Jess's. Somehow I don't believe that. He wouldn't give this to me. In fact, all the gifts you've brought over the past several years are just family treasures you smuggled out from Plumas, aren't they? Jess couldn't maintain an innocent expression. Would you have it any other way? Ross held the logbook, pretending not to care, but Jess could see that the gift meant a great deal to him, even if it came from his brother rather than his father. They both knew Bram Tamblyn very well. He was a stern and inflexible family leader, and for all his life he'd insisted on having everything precisely his own way. That attitude worked well enough with his employees in the water mining operation under the ice sheets of Plumas. However, Bram Tamblyn's firstborn son had turned out to be just as stubborn as his father. The two had gotten into frequent shouting matches for years until finally, after he reached the age of 22, Ross had had enough. Old Bram had threatened to disown his son if he didn't bow to his wishes, and the young man astonished his father by calling his bluff. Tempers were high. Outraged, Bram vowed he would excise Ross from their clan, so Ross offered to save him the embarrassment. He requested the portion of the family inheritance that was due him, and swore he would make his own success. Jess had been there, along with Tasya. Though they intervened, trying to make peace between the two, the old man would have none of it. Bram had gotten a calculating look in his eye. His clan's fortunes were increasing year by year, and if Ross took his inheritance now and quit his claim to all future income, he would surely come out the loser. So Bram tallied up his son's share and gave it to him, telling Ross never to ask for another penny. And Ross had not. He had invested his inheritance wisely, taking over the operation of the Blue Sky mine, which he ran with such grace and skill that it had nearly climbed out of debt by the time Ross turned 28. Old Bram pretended anger and chagrin, but was secretly proud. When Jess came to visit the sky mining station, there was never any animosity between the brothers. On the other hand, thanks to Ross's stubbornness, Jess would someday become the official head of the Tamblyn clan and inherit the lucrative Plumas water mines, becoming a powerful man in his own right. He didn't want it, but he would not let anyone down. Ahead of the Blue Sky mine, an anvil of grayish rust cloud rose from the lower layers. Ross went to a set of controls and diverted the exhaust plumes, using them like attitude-control jets. The huge cloud trawler shifted its course and banked northward so that they passed a yawning maelstrom of angry clouds. That hurricane could swallow a whole planet, Ross said. Distressed, the pet doves fluttered behind the sky mine, following their only roost. Just as long as it doesn't swallow this sky mine, Jess said. Any danger? Not with me at the helm. When the winds get rough, I can always climb to a different layer. He waited and then finally turned expectant eyes on his younger brother. So, did you bring anything from Cheska? Jess forced a light tone into his voice. This was the hardest part of everything he was expected to do. You think you need more than her love? No, I suppose I don't. Jess wanted to change the subject, unable to shake the image of the beautiful Francesca Peroni, to whom Ross had been betrothed for years. Jai Okaya has just filed a formal petition that legally names Cheska her heir as speaker for the roamers. No surprise at all. Ross looked proud, but his voice was businesslike. She's a very talented woman. Yes, he is. Jess closed his mouth to keep himself from saying more. It wasn't his place. Sadly, for more than a year, Jess himself had been deeply in love with Jessica, and he knew the feeling was very mutual. Her betrothal to Ross had occurred long before she and Jess had met, and Romer honor and politics would never allow her to break the engagement. Neither would Jess's sense of duty to his brother. Besides, Ross had worked so hard to meet the difficult conditions he and Jessica had agreed on for their wedding. Jess would never do anything to hurt or embarrass his brother, and neither would Jessica. Both were loyal to Ross, and all of them were bound by the complex social restrictions of the Romer culture. Jess had resigned himself to an unrequited love. He would stand strong and live without her, though Jessica would always be in his heart. Ross had no inkling of his brother's attraction for his fiancée, and Jess had privately sworn never to let him discover that fact. The cost to all of them would be far too great. After sharing a meal and playing a few rounds of star games with 3 crew workers, Jess slept in a guest bunk. He left the Blue Sky mine early the following morning when Golgan's sun was just creeping above the fuzzy horizon. Bidding Ross farewell, Jess detached the valuable load of Star Drive fuel and began to pilot the cargo escort away from the Golgan system to a Romer transport station where it would be offloaded to Goose distribution ships. He also carried gifts and letters from Ross because after completing his delivery, Jess intended to make his way to the central Romer complex of rendezvous. With an ache in his heart, but a neutral expression on his face, he would dutifully deliver his brother's romantic presents to Jessica Peroni. Chapter 14. Jessica Peroni. The Romer yacht maintained its position at the arranged meeting point in empty space. The private yacht bore no markings to indicate that it carried the important speaker for all Romer clans, along with her protégé. Playing their political cards close to the chest, Romers rarely resorted to emblems or trappings of power. Jessica Peroni sat in the co-pilot seat, monitoring the emptiness, keeping watch on her sensors. Distant stars twinkled all around them, partially muffled by thin wisps of nebular gas. No sign of the other ship yet. With large eyes, dusky skin, and a sense of humor matched only by her sense of duty, Jessica always kept both her mind and her eyes open. Beside her, the sinewy old woman, Jai Okaya, stared through the window port as if she found every single star worth looking at. "Patience. Patience." The ancient speaker had vast reserves of inner calm and an intelligence that she never flaunted when speaking to others. A light blinked on Jessica's control panel. "Ah, here he comes." Jai Okaya pursed her lips as she studied the starscape to pick out the tiny dot that heralded the diplomatic transport ship bearing the Theran heir, Reynold. For months, the son of Mother Alexa and Father Idris had worked through intermediaries and scattered messages to arrange this meeting with representatives of the Romers. His persistence had been admirable. "He's finally getting what he requested," Jai Okaya said in her raspy voice. "I can't help but chuckle at how astonished Chairman Wenceslas would be if he knew Reynold had gone to so much trouble just to see a few Romers." Jessica looked at the speaker. Perhaps this young man understands more about us than other human governments do. Both women knew about Reynold's peregrination, and they respected the young man's interest in all significant societies of the Spiral Arm, including the oft-dismissed space gypsies. Jai Okaya frowned. "Or perhaps we haven't been keeping our secrets as well as we think." Though their nomadic society had many ships and a great deal of wealth, the clans kept their operations thoroughly confidential and avoided drawing attention to themselves. The old woman's limbs were thin, and her bones as brittle as dry bamboo, which required her to spend most of her time at the Romer asteroid conglomeration of Rendezvous. Jai Okaya had been married 4 times and had outlived every one of her husbands. She'd borne several children from each mate, so that she had a total of 14 sons and daughters, 53 grandchildren, and an ever-increasing number of great-grandchildren. The old speaker didn't bother keeping track anymore. Finally, the Theron diplomatic transport pulled alongside the Romer yacht, deftly maneuvering with jets and aligning the 2 vessels. After the airlock connections were attached, Reynold stepped across into the yacht's receiving area. The Theron prince's dark hair was bunched together in a mass of braids. Tattoos stood out at his collar and along his neck. His handsome face broke into a polite smile before he bowed to the 2 women, eyes flashing at Cheska in obvious admiration. She fought back a flush from his open scrutiny. "I apologize that we can't welcome you with more ceremony," Jayokaya said, gesturing him into their small common chamber, which held refreshments, a table large enough to seat a few people, and little else. "You must be accustomed to everything on a grander scale coming from Theroc." Reynold spread his hands. "At times I prefer a more intimate setting. Besides," he looked at Jayokaya, then gave Cheska a longer, more intense smile, "I wish to speak with you too, not 1,000 others in an audience." After they exchanged sips of pepper-flower tea and a few token gifts, Jayokaya took a seat and regarded him. "You have whetted our curiosity, young man. Tell me, what have the Romers done to arouse the interest of a prince of Theroc?" Reynold leaned across the table, clasping his hands and seeming to exude an earnestness that Cheska didn't believe was an act. "It's occurred to me that Romers and Therons have much in common. We've both dodged the net of the Hansa. Theroc alone among the colony worlds remains independent. All others have signed the Hansa Charter. Romers also live their own lives and govern themselves without Terran restrictions." Cheska said, "That is because we both provide vital services. You with your green priests, and us with our Ekti." Reynold raised a finger. "But still the trap is always there. Now, I'm not advocating any drastic change, because if we were to rouse the ire of the Hansa, there's no telling what desperate actions they might take. However, we could arrange a few minor alliances between our peoples, reciprocal concessions to strengthen our respective foundations." Cheska looked at Jayokaya, but the old woman maintained her focus on Reynold. "I would not argue against having more security from the whims of Earth. You've obviously thought about this a great deal, young man." "As heir to the throne, I've had years to think about what I might do. Now I'm exploring some of my ideas." "And what are they?" Cheska asked. Reynold frankly addressed their several joint concerns. "Let me start from your perspective. Romer sky mines produce most of the Ekti used in the spiral arm. Cargo escorts deliver Ekti from sky mines to transport stations where it's distributed solely by the Terran Hanseatic League. Theroc and other human settlements have no other place to purchase Ekti because of the Hansa's benevolent monopoly. Why should they have such a stranglehold on Ekti distribution?" "Are you suggesting the Hansa is engaging in unfair trade practices?" Reynold took a sip of his spicy tea. "It's no secret that they recently imposed severe tariff increases and changed their policies, which was detrimental to Romer business. Isn't that why Rand Sorengard began preying on Hansa merchant ships?" Cheska frowned. "He is an internal problem among the Romers. We have many clans and many strong-willed people. Occasionally some of our people become unruly. Unfortunately, even the speaker can't keep control of them all." "And how would you change these trade practices, young man?" Jayokaya said, returning the conversation to the business at hand. "Well, Theroc does not have a large space fleet. Most of us prefer to remain in the world forest without ever venturing elsewhere in the spiral arm. However, like every civilized world, we do engage in interstellar travel, and our green priests take treelings to other planets to spread the forest as widely as possible. Therefore, we require Ekti. At present, we are beholden to the Hansa for this vital resource. He smiled again. I would like to explore the possibility that roamers and Therans could arrange for a more direct supply agreement. Cheska gave a wicked grin. Oh, the goose wouldn't like that at all. Not at all. Jai Okaya looked at her student and nodded. But I don't believe any legal restrictions prevent it. Reynald's suggestion surprised Cheska, since few outsiders took the roamers seriously, seeing them as ragtag groups that happened to provide a useful product. The Hansa had never bothered to keep track of how many sky mines the roamers operated or what gas planets they harvested. The spiral arm had so many uninhabited systems, so many gas giants, who could possibly monitor them all? How could a Hansa spy ship spot even a huge floating factory against the backdrop of a planet larger than Jupiter? With apparent innocence, Reynald asked probing questions about roamer bases and facilities, but Jai Okaya skillfully dodged them all, giving the young man no useful information. I must discuss this with the other clans, Reynald. However, I welcome the opening of relations between Therans and roamers. What is it you are offering for your own part? Reynald could not stop grinning. Perhaps the Therans could provide the services of a few green priests? With all of your far-flung clans, I'm sure the roamers could make use of instantaneous communication. True. We are a widely dispersed people, and news travels slowly, the old woman said. But we have learned to live with our own methods. We follow the guiding star. Still, sometimes you may wish to learn of significant events more quickly. Reynald's eyes were bright. He leaned across the small table in the yacht's galley, ready to tell a secret. For instance, our green priests have just passed along a report from General Lanyon that Rand Sorengard was recently apprehended and executed near Wairika. The EDF set up an ambush for him and captured all of his crew. They were all sent out the airlock. Cheska and Jai Okaya met each other's gaze. Cheska swallowed hard. Damned eddies. That's bad news indeed. Reynald seemed surprised. Did you actually support Sorengard's activities? He seemed more of a revolutionary than a pirate. We understand his motivations, young man. For roamers have been unfairly treated by the Hansa. Violence, however, only brings about further violence, rather than any acceptable resolution. As spokesperson for the roamers, I can never condone his methods. The old speaker turned back to business. Nevertheless, Prince Reynald, we must respectfully decline your most generous offer. Cheska regarded the brawny, handsome young man. I have to agree. Allowing green priests to live among the roamers is simply impossible. The idea of having a stranger view their most carefully hidden installations sent a chill down her spine. While the Telink process provided instant communication, such information became available to all green priests everywhere. The roamers would never open themselves that much. Reynald took the rejection with good grace and a wry smile. Basil Wenceslas would fall all over himself to have more priests, but we've turned him down. Your reaction is quite different from my experience with the Terran Hanseatic League. Roamer society is very different from that of other humans. Reynald slid a glance over at the beautiful Cheska, obviously flirting. We might consider a different sort of alliance, then? A marriage, perhaps? But Cheska raised her hand, looking first at her delicate fingers and then meeting his eyes. Such a joining would indeed be a valuable political alliance, but I must inform you that I am already betrothed to the chief of a large and profitable sky mine. And, she thought, I am in love with his brother. Reynold looked away with an embarrassed expression that made him seem much younger. Then he is a very lucky man. Cheska felt sorry for him, even mildly attracted to him. But her impending marriage with Ross Tamlin was unbreakable despite her secret feelings for Jess. Adding Reynold to the equation would make the already complicated situation intolerable. Still, though nothing had been resolved, Reynold seemed generally happy with the discussions. He bowed again. Before I return to Tharok after this long peregrination, allow me to extend a most heartfelt invitation to you or any other roamer you choose as your representative to visit our spectacular world forest. Sooner or later you must get tired of empty space. Space is never empty, if you know what you are looking for. Cheska clasped his hand warmly. Still, I look forward to seeing it someday. Chapter 15. Nira Kali. Perched at the top of the world, Nira Kali curled her toes around the frond and stood balanced without a care and unafraid, even so high up in the sky. She had not yet taken the green, had not felt the world tree's song pulsing through her blood, or seen the green tinge darken in her skin. Nevertheless, she trusted the world forest with all her soul. Her skin was dusky brown, but soon she would bear the photosynthetic pigmentation that would show everyone that she had been accepted by the magnificent trees. An acolyte for most of her young life, she understood the way of the forest, communed with the enigmatic interconnected mind, even though the trees couldn't hear her directly. Not yet. For her day's assignment, Nira read aloud, in a rich, dramatic voice, engrossed in the stories from ancient literature that the Kaye colonists had brought with them. She sensed that the trees liked these stories of King Arthur and his knights of the Round Table. She had read several different versions of Le Morte d'Arthur by Sir Thomas Malory, as well as myriad retellings by Howard Pyle, John Steinbeck, and a succession of others. There were many inconsistencies among the legends, but Nira didn't think the trees were confused. The forest mind actually enjoyed contradictions and discrepancies, and occupied a portion of its slow, semi-waking consciousness pondering the implications. Nira served the world forest by reading to the trees, but she also delighted in the opportunity to learn for herself. From childhood, she had spent years keeping records of where missionary green priests were distributed around the spiral arm, bearing treelings, spreading the forest. Young acolytes were taught to tend the forest. They nurtured the smallest potted treelings prepared for transportation off-world. They cared for the largest ancient sentinels, plucking off old fronds and picking bark clean of parasites. Nira preferred reading aloud, and she thought the trees enjoyed it as well. When she talked to the trees, even while she was doing menial tasks, Nira always kept her mind open and her ears cocked, listening for an answer. One day, when she was a green priest, she would hear the voice. Barefoot and bare-chested, acolytes wore only loincloths, exposing as much skin as possible to the trees. Human skin was a sensitive receptor, an interface with the world trees. Whenever Nira climbed to the canopy for her daily work, she stroked the fronds, pressed her chest against the trunk. She had shorn her dark hair close to the scalp, as most acolytes did, leaving only a fuzz on the crown of her head. All her hair would fall out as soon as she took the green. Since childhood, she had recognized her destiny to become part of the ecological web of the world forest, which grew year after year. Before the Kaye had been brought here long ago, the world forest had been only an isolated group of semi-intelligent trees on a single planet. There, because it had no way to grow intellectually or experience new things, the world forest had languished in isolation for thousands of years. However, when the settlers came, a girl named Thara Wen had learned to commune with the forest and she taught other sensitive individuals. These early priests had discovered how to tap into the ponderous memory that was capable of storing and recalling vast amounts of information. The world trees were a living database, hampered only by a lack of experiences and outside knowledge. Thara Wen and her followers had taken care of that problem. As the world forest began to learn from its human companions, the relationship blossomed into a beneficial symbiosis. Green priests explained mathematics and science, history and folklore. Once its appetite was whetted, the world forest wanted to absorb all human knowledge, from the dullest facts to the most sweeping legends. The arboreal computer could assimilate and assess 1,000 tangential pieces of information and make brilliant and accurate projections, almost like prophecies from a benevolent earth spirit. Around her, other acolytes read dull-sounding data, reciting records of weather patterns on planets she'd never even heard of. Nero was quite happy to be ensconced in the boughs with Mallory's epic chronicle. Priests played musical instruments or activated recordings of symphonies created by human composers. To the world forest, music was as much a language as words. Alone under the sky, Nera read for hours, not even shifting her position, completely focused on the story and on the listening trees. The trees could receive information in other ways, through direct telepathic link with functional green priests, but Nera didn't have that option. Besides, she preferred to read aloud. It was the way stories were meant to be told, and the world forest seemed to grasp that. Somehow, even without the symbiosis established, these magnificent plants understood that Nera would become part of their overall network soon. Very soon, she hoped. As the afternoon waned toward twilight, Nera's voice grew scratchy, and she realized that she hadn't taken a drink from her water flask in hours. She looked up to see older priests descending from their platforms, finished with the day's activities. She gulped from her flask, swallowing the stimulating Klee, pure water mixed with ground seeds from the world trees. She felt awake, eager to read another 100 pages, but it was time to attend to her other duties. As she climbed down to the juncture of the largest fronds, she met a tall, middle-aged priest named Yarod, the younger brother of Mother Alexa. The many tattoos on his green face bore witness to the different subjects he had studied and abilities he had acquired in the name of the world forest. Though the green priests had a very loose and generous hierarchy, Yarod was one of the senior members, though his position had little to do with his relation to the leader. "Nera Kali, I have come to escort you. Our council has met, and the trees have approved." "Approved?" Nera's heart leaped. Approved of what? Possibilities ran through her mind, and she couldn't decide which she hoped for most. Anchoring his feet against the branches, Yarod removed a vial from the rope at his waist. "The priests offer you our congratulations." Smiling, he unstoppered the tiny vial and let a dark liquid drop onto his fingertip. "You have completed the training necessary to receive your second reader's mark." He extended his fingertip, and Nera felt a rush, pleased to have achieved a new rank so quickly. She already bore the mark of an acolyte on her forehead, and 2 arcs at the corners of her mouth and eyes that showed she had observed the necessary subjects to become a first-rank reader. Yarod's fingertip paused, and then he laughed. "Nera, I cannot put the marks around your mouth if you are grinning so much." She tried to form her face into a stoic, calm expression. He deftly smeared dark juice in a perfect curve along each side of her mouth, broader in radius than the first set of arcs. The juice stung as it soaked into her skin, where it would alter the chemistry of her tissues, leaving a permanent mark. It would burn for a day before she was allowed to wash it off, but the mark would be there for all to see that she had achieved another level. "Thank you, Yarod. I am pleased to serve the world forest in any capacity. Such recognition encourages me to work harder for the next level." Yarod continued to smile. "I'm not finished yet, Nera. That was merely an introduction." Nera's heart thumped again in her chest. The priests have discussed the current acolytes and studied their dedication and drive." He looked at her with bright eyes. Nira held her breath, but he could see right through her thoughts. "We have decided that you have earned more than just another tattoo of learning. Your acolyte service to the World Forest has been exemplary. It could only improve if you were to become a full-fledged green priest." Nira felt the trees singing around her, laughing or congratulating her. She couldn't tell which, but soon she would. She gripped the electronic book plaque in her hand so hard she was afraid it might slip from between her sweaty fingertips and tumble to the distant forest floor. She dared not let that happen. Nira raised her chin and blinked back the tears in her eyes, looking proudly at Yarod. Her only regret was that she had been unable to finish reading the tale of King Arthur and his knights. That would probably be for another acolyte to do. Chapter 16. Rolinda Kett. Rolinda Kett was delighted to be back aboard Voracious Curiosity. Her merchant ship was fully repaired, cleaned, and even upgraded after having been used as bait against Rand Sorengard's corsairs. Now she relaxed in her custom-widened captain's chair as the ship approached Ferak. She came at the surprising invitation of Sarain Theron herself, the third child of Father Idris and Mother Alexa. The daughter had more business sense than anyone in the family as far as Rolinda was concerned. Sarain was only 21, a beautiful and savvy woman who had already made connections with the Hansa, extending her network of favors. Rolinda couldn't help but respect Sarain. Certainly it would have been politically unwise to turn down the offer to come to Therak to discuss matters of interest to people such as ourselves. From her time spent studying on Earth, Sarain had a less provincial mindset than either of her parents or any of her siblings. The Therans were insular in their trade practices, keeping a tight hold on the green priests and not inclined to develop new customers for their myriad forest products. As a trader, Rolinda had often looked with interest at Therak, but considered the cultural restrictions too severe for much of a trade relationship. Sarain, though, seemed to be changing all that with her overt offer. The Theran colony was self-sufficient and aloof from the Hanseatic League. The EDF and the Hansa had never pressed the issue, keeping the forest inhabitants happy because they were the only source of green priests, but the Therans refused to be exploited. Rolinda Kett did not have exploitation in mind at all, though. Only mutual benefit. She always dealt fairly with her customers and her suppliers. That was how interstellar trade should work. Still, she kept an eye open for new trade opportunities. She would certainly listen to Sarain's offer. Despite her 5 marriages, Rolinda had no children. Instead, she operated 4 merchant ships, including the Voracious Curiosity, which was her baby. More than just the owner of her own shipping company, Rolinda was one of the best captains as well. Each of her other captains went out to secure cargoes independently, taking risks and reaping rewards. She hadn't yet decided if she would try to find a replacement for the Great Expectations and Captain Gabriel Mesta. Though they had to buy into her franchise and pay a large fee, the captains were allowed to keep 75% of the profits they brought in. If a captain suffered 3 losses in a row, however, Rolinda's shipping company ousted him and opened the position for a new captain willing to sign on. She'd needed to do that only once, and the man hadn't even been married to her. Descending through Therak's misty atmosphere, Rolinda followed the tracker beacons down into a clearing in the densely wooded terrain, where she expertly landed the ship among the tall trees. With a delighted smile on her broad, dark face, she climbed out. Around her, the clustered world trees spread out in an undulating ocean of foliage as far as the eye could see. After days aboard the merchant ship, she relished the moist, perfumed atmosphere. She drew another breath to purge the residue of spaceship air from her lungs. Caught in her smiling reverie, Relinda turned and was surprised to see a slender young woman waiting. Saraine's eyes were large and dark, her skin a deep bronze. Her hips were narrow, her breasts small, and her dark hair cut in a short, serviceable style. Saraine's garments were an unusual mixture of home-dyed cocoon fiber fabrics, natural products from Therak, highlighted with processed polymers and glittering jewelry from Earth. Relinda Kett, thank you for coming here. Your journey was long, but I promise you the rewards will be worth the trouble. No trouble, the merchant said, patting the hull of her ship. Glad to have the opportunity to see this place with my own eyes. I've heard many intriguing things about Therak. Sarain gave a brief, surprised frown, which she covered with a welcoming smile. Intriguing, truly? Maybe I've missed something. Sarain led her toward the fungus reef city where hundreds of families lived. The massive communal dwelling was a whitish-gray growth fossilized in the junctures of several large world trees. The fungus reef was a giant swelling built up from thousands of generations of hard, shelf-like mushrooms. The huge fungus continued to spread as it sprayed layers of spores on top of itself, hardening as it grew older like a fungal coral reef. It looks like bubbly whipped cream, Relinda said. Sarain smiled at the reference. I loved whipped cream when I was on Earth. But this is hard and filled with gaps and holes. Enough to build an entire city. Sarain escorted her through the marvelous organic monument. The first colonists from the Caille abandoned their prefabricated shelters early on and moved into these fungus reefs. She rapped her knuckles on the spongy yet sturdy wall. Then they augmented, decorated, and added to the city plumbing, lighting strips, coolant systems, power conduits, and communication nodes. It's not exactly primitive. Relinda's eyes brightened. Still, seems to me there could be a market here for a few new amenities. Sarain flashed a glance at the large merchant woman, smiling in agreement, though she didn't say it out loud. Tell me, though, Relinda said, how is it that I'm the one who came to your attention? The Hansa has hundreds of merchants who would love to make their pitch. I thought of you, Relinda Kett, because you applied for licenses to explore the marketability of certain food items and jungle fabrics. Everyone else who pokes around on Therak is only interested in the green priests. You seem different. She lowered her voice. A few test cargoes may well be the wedge that we need with my parents. You could be our first intermediary. Relinda was barely able to believe her good fortune. If that's my duty, I'm happy to serve. Sarain wore a dreamy look. Chairman Wenceslas is also very supportive of any venture that brings my world into the larger fold of galactic commerce. He told me so himself.